The draw of utilizing a massive metropolitan subway system is that it offers a perfectly predictable, synchronized way to navigate the chaotic underbelly of a major city. Every single day, millions of commuters step onto these subterranean platforms, swipe their transit cards, and board steel transit cars that hurtle through dark, brick-lined tunnels at 60 miles per hour. It is an environment defined by routine, public crowds, and a complete reliance on transit security. But for 36-year-old night shift transit security monitor Marcus Briggs, a late-night surveillance rotation at a major underground junction in Brooklyn, New York, in the spring of 2022 would turn into a horrifying demonstration of how fragile that security truly is. He would discover that a closed-circuit television monitor can capture an event that completely defies the laws of physical reality, and that some passengers who board the train at midnight have absolutely no intention of ever stepping off. The setting for the story is the Hoyt-Schermerhorn subway station, a deep, multi-level transit knot located beneath downtown Brooklyn. It was the 24th of April, 2022, a night where a bitter, unseasonable spring downpour had flooded the street gutters above, forcing a thick, heavy humidity down into the lower concrete platforms. The air inside the underground station was stagnant, chilly, and smelled intensely of hot steel brakes, damp concrete, and the faint, chemical scent of old garbage rot. Marcus was a highly disciplined, 9-year veteran of the Transit Authority's security division. He sat in a dimly lit, locked surveillance booth on the upper mezzanine level, surrounded by a massive wall of glowing monitors displaying live feeds from 40 different platforms and tunnel junctions. He was a practical, data-driven man who viewed the subway system as a giant, mechanical grid completely devoid of any belief in urban legends, ghost trains, or underground superstitions. Around 1:15 a.m., the heavy rush of late-night commuters had completely dwindled away, leaving the deep lower platforms in an eerie, absolute silence. Marcus leaned forward in his mesh chair, sipping a cup of black coffee, his eyes tracking the live feed of Platform 4, which serviced the late-night local trains heading toward the outer boroughs. At exactly 1:32 a.m., a vintage, faded silver transit car pulled into the empty station, its heavy brakes letting out a long metallic shriek that echoed through the tiled tunnels. The pneumatic doors slid open with a loud mechanical hiss, revealing a completely dark, unlit passenger compartment. Sitting perfectly still on the center orange bench of the dark car was a lone passenger. He looked like a 30-year-old man wearing a heavy, dark canvas jacket, his head bowed down toward his chest. Marcus tapped his keyboard, zooming the high-definition security camera closer to the train window to see if the passenger was experiencing a medical emergency. As the digital lens adjusted its focus, the smile completely vanished from Marcus's face. The image on his monitor was perfectly sharp, but the anatomy of the passenger was completely wrong. The man's canvas jacket was loose, but underneath the fabric, his torso was so incredibly emaciated that his ribs and an elongated, segmented spine pushed sharply against his clothing like jagged ridges. His skin, visible around his collar, was a dull, leathery, bruised gray color, completely hairless and glistened with a thick, clear fluid that looked like liquid mucus. His double-jointed arms were twice the length of a normal human's, his long, multi-jointed fingers ending in sharp black claws that were buried deep into the fiberglass structure of the bench. But it was the head that made the breath catch sharply in Marcus's throat. The passenger's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing his hairless, pale skull to hang completely upside down between his shoulders. He had no visible nose or ears, but where the eyes should have been, the infrared sensor of the security camera caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of two massive, glassy black orbs. The entity was staring straight into the surveillance lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums. Marcus sat perfectly paralyzed in the dark security booth, the pale blue glow of the monitor screens illuminating his face. His logical brain tried to reject it. He watched the digital timer on the screen tick forward. The train doors remained open for exactly 30 seconds, but nobody stepped off and nobody boarded. Then, from the desktop audio monitor on Marcus's console, which broadcast the live audio feed from the Platform 4 microphone, came a sound. It wasn't the low hum of the train's generator, and it wasn't the wind rushing through the shafts. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise, the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone at an impossible velocity. And as Marcus watched in absolute, unadulterated horror, the creature slowly shifted its weight off the orange bench. It dropped onto all fours, its long, double-jointed limbs moving with a fluid, spider-like velocity as it compressed its entire 7-foot frame flat against the floor of the train car, heading straight toward the open sliding doors. Marcus realized with an absolute terrifying certainty that if that door closed and the train moved into the dark transit tunnels, the entity would be loose within the core infrastructure of the city. He slammed his hand onto the emergency radio button, his voice cracking with pure survival adrenaline as he ordered the platform conductor to hold the train and seal the lower platform gates. The mechanical chattering from the intercom speaker accelerated, growing so loud that the audio amplifiers began to clip and hiss. The entity slid out of the dark car, its long limbs propelling its body across the wet concrete of Platform 4, moving directly toward the base of the security booth's stairwell. Marcus did not wait for the creature to reach the top of the stairs. He lunged across the control console, slamming the switch down. A series of thick, reinforced steel security grates dropped from the ceiling with a deafening crash, sealing the security booth behind a solid metal barrier just as a heavy impact rattled the outer walls. Through the glass viewing window, Marcus could see the steel grates vibrating under a succession of rapid, violent strikes. The entity was on the other side of the glass, compressed flat against the vertical concrete wall of the mezzanine corridor. It brought its hands up against the glass partition, its long, black, calcified claws scraping against the smooth surface with a slow, agonizing shriek. Screech. Then, the desktop audio monitor on his console erupted into a chaotic mess of sound. The creature opened its unhinged jaw wide, and a voice came out of the speaker. It was a perfectly flat, mechanical male tone, repeating Marcus's own security badge number and his full name over and over again in an identical dead loop. Officer Marcus Briggs. Officer Marcus Briggs. Monitor station closed. The sheer, psychological horror broke Marcus's mind. He backed away from the console, his knees giving out as he collapsed onto the concrete floor of the booth, covering his ears with both hands to block out the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone that followed. The New York City Transit Police and a heavily armed tactical response unit arrived at the Hoyt-Schermerhorn station at approximately 2:15 a.m., initiating a full lockdown of the entire transit line. When the tactical sweep team entered the upper mezzanine level with high-powered searchlights, the corridor was completely quiet. The humid air smelled intensely of copper, hot grease, and a thick, sulfur-like chemical rot. The passenger was completely gone. The reinforced steel security grates outside Marcus's booth were deeply dented, covered in thick, parallel gouge marks that had sliced straight through the metal coating. What the Transit Authority's internal engineering team discovered when they analyzed the structural telemetry of the station's lower tunnels is what caused the entire deep platform level to be permanently sealed from the public within 72 hours. The investigators found that the creature had ripped open a heavy iron ventilation grate located directly beneath the third rail on Platform 4, cutting straight into a massive, forgotten network of unmapped maintenance tunnels that ran parallel to the active subway lines for miles. The old brick walls of the forgotten grid were completely covered in thousands of long, five-fingered claw marks worn smooth by years of subterranean movement. The creature hadn't just boarded the train that night. It had been utilizing the forgotten, abandoned transit networks constructed during the early development of the city to navigate beneath the feet of millions of unsuspecting Brooklyn residents for decades, traveling from borough to borough completely undetected. Furthermore, when the digital analysts recovered the backup data from Marcus's terminal before the power failure, they realized the vintage silver transit car hadn't suffered an electrical glitch. The diagnostic log showed that the internal lights of the car had been drained by a massive localized electromagnetic draw, meaning the entity was naturally capable of manipulating electrical infrastructure simply by accelerating the rhythmic clicking of its own skeletal joints. The Metropolitan Transportation Authority permanently closed Platform 4 of the Hoyt-Schermerhorn station 3 weeks after the incident. A specialized construction crew used 500 tons of industrial concrete to wall off the lower tunnels completely, pouring liquid cement into the ventilation shafts and erasing the platform from all future transit maps and public directories. Marcus Briggs never monitored a security screen again, and he never rode a subway train again. He resigned from his position at the Transit Authority, packed his belongings into a U-Haul truck, and relocated to a small single-story home in the flat, sun-baked desert of western Texas, a region with no underground transit, no deep tunnels, and absolutely no subterranean infrastructure. He managed to build a quiet daytime routine as a rural delivery driver, but the psychological scars of that April night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to enter any building with a basement, he cannot tolerate dark, enclosed rooms, and he leaves a high-powered tactical lantern burning on his nightstand 24 hours a day. Because according to Marcus, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true horror lives in the realization of what is riding right beneath us. Every time he hears a faint, muffled rumble from the ground, or watches a shadow shift near a floor vent, his entire body goes completely cold. He realizes that humanity is just walking on a thin, fragile crust of concrete and asphalt, entirely unaware that deep within the ancient, forgotten foundations of the city, something impossible is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the next passenger to step off. The environment of a large metropolitan hospital at 3 o'clock in the morning is a very specific kind of quiet. The bustling energy of the daytime shifts has completely cleared out, leaving the long, polished hallways bathed in a dim, fluorescent hum. The air inside smells sharply of rubbing alcohol, bleached linens, and that cold, sterile ventilation air that seems to dry out your throat within minutes. For 35-year-old night shift radiology technician Austin Vance, working the graveyard rotation at a major medical center in Denver, Colorado, in the winter of 2021 was supposed to be just another predictable shift of processing broken bones and routine chest scans. But on the night of the 14th of December 2021, a patient would walk through the doors of the emergency room who would completely shatter Austin's understanding of human biology. He would discover that a standard medical image meant to diagnose a simple injury could capture a secret so terrifying that it would force an entire hospital floor into an immediate federal lockdown. The patient was a 32-year-old backcountry skier named Garrett Vance, who had been brought in by a friend after getting lost for several hours in a remote, unmapped valley near the Arapahoe National Forest. Garrett was a practical, athletic guy who looked at the natural world through a lens of strict logic and sport. He had arrived at the emergency room complaining of a deep, dull ache in his central rib cage, claiming he had taken a hard fall into a deep limestone fissure hidden beneath the snow. Austin was a highly disciplined professional who had processed thousands of scans over his 10-year career. He was a thoroughly data-driven individual who viewed the human body as a predictable machine, completely devoid of any belief in medical anomalies or unexplainable phenomena. Around 3:15 a.m., Austin wheeled Garrett into the cold, heavily shielded radiology suite to take a standard 3-view chest X-ray. The atmosphere inside the scanning room was intensely quiet, broken only by the low mechanical whine of the massive X-ray tube positioning itself above the leather examination table. Austin stepped behind the heavy lead glass viewing partition, instructed Garrett to hold his breath, and pressed the primary exposure button. The machine emitted a short, sharp buzz as the radiation passed through Garrett's chest, capturing the internal structures on the digital receptor below. As the high-resolution digital image rendered onto Austin's primary viewing monitor, the breath completely caught in his throat, The skeletal structure on the screen was perfectly sharp, but the anatomy was completely wrong. Garrett's lungs and heart were visible, but his central ribcage had been entirely replaced by a series of jagged, calcified vertical ridges that resembled interlocking stone teeth. Pushing sharply against his spine was an elongated, segmented secondary skeletal column that extended upward toward his collarbone, looking less like a human backbone and more like the rigid exoskeleton of a massive predatory insect. But it was the upper section of the image that made Austin's heart give a violent, uncomfortable thud against his ribs. The X-ray showed a long, thin, secondary muscular structure that was tightly wrapped around Garrett's primary windpipe, extending directly into his throat. And hiding right behind his collarbone, completely integrated into his flesh, were two massive, dense, perfectly circular organic spheres that completely absorbed the radiation, showing up on the monitor as two solid, glassy black orbs. Austin stood perfectly paralyzed behind the lead glass, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold his digital stylus, his logical brain completely fractured. He looked through the viewing window at Garrett, who was sitting quietly on the edge of the examination table, casually adjusting his hospital gown as if nothing was wrong. Austin slowly keyed the internal intercom microphone, his voice cracking with pure adrenaline, asking Garrett if he had ever undergone any major reconstructive surgeries or spinal fusions. Garrett did not answer the question. He slowly turned his head toward the lead glass window. The movement was unnatural. His neck didn't turn with a smooth human rotation. It elongated slightly, twisting at a horrific 70-degree angle with a succession of sharp, dry, audible biological cracks that echoed through the quiet room. Then Garrett opened his mouth wide. From deep within his throat, picking up with terrifying clarity on the room's high-sensitivity intercom microphone, came a sound. It wasn't a voice, and it wasn't a gasp for air. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise, the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone at an impossible velocity. Click, 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 click. And as Austin watched in absolute, unadulterated horror, Garrett's pupils completely dilated, his eyes transforming into two massive, glassy black orbs that perfectly reflected the pale blue light of the monitor screens. He shifted his weight, launching his body off the examination table onto all fours, his long, double-jointed limbs moving with a fluid, spider-like speed as he headed straight for the heavy security door separating the suite. Austin reacted out of pure, base survival instinct. He lunged across the desk and slammed his hand onto the emergency manual lockdown button on the wall panel. The heavy, lead-lined security door slid shut with a loud mechanical hiss, the steel deadbolts locking into the frame just a fraction of a second before Garrett's body slammed into the glass window. The impact was so violent that the reinforced lead glass webbed with a network of fine cracks. Garrett was no longer moving like a man. He was compressed flat against the other side of the glass, his long, double-jointed limbs splayed out like a predatory insect. Through the cracked partition, Austin could see the creature's gray, leathery torso pulsing rapidly beneath the torn hospital gown, and its thin neck remained twisted at that horrific angle. It brought its hands up against the glass, its fingernails completely gone, replaced by thick, black, calcified claws that began to scrape against the reinforced window with a slow, agonizing shriek. Screech. Then, the intercom speaker on Austin's desk crackled to life again. The creature didn't use a human voice. Instead, it used the high-sensitivity microphone to blast that dry, rapid chattering of bone against bone directly into the control booth. Click, 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 click. The frequency of the sound was immense, vibrating so intensely through the electronic equipment that Austin's computer monitors began to flicker violently, their displays distorting into bands of green static. Austin staggered backward, covering his ears, as his nose began to bleed from the sheer concussive pressure of the acoustic wave. He didn't wait for the glass to shatter. He turned and threw open the rear exit door of the radiology booth, sprinting out into the long, dark corridor of the hospital's lower level. He did not call for the elevator. He ran straight for the emergency stairwell, his sneakers slapping loudly against the polished linoleum floors as he fled toward the security office on the main floor. The Denver Police Department and a specialized federal medical response unit arrived at the hospital at approximately 3:45 a.m., placing the entire wing under an immediate tactical quarantine. The on-duty staff were restricted to their stations, and all entrance gates were locked down with heavy-duty security chains. When the heavily armed tactical team entered the radiology suite with high-powered searchlights and ballistic shields, the room was completely quiet. The cold, sterile air smelled intensely of copper, ozone, and a thick, sulfur-like chemical rot. Garrett Vance was completely gone. The heavy lead-lined security door had been violently buckled outward from the inside, the steel deadbolts sheared cleanly off their mountings. The leather examination table had been torn to shreds, and the massive X-ray tube above it was shattered, its heavy components twisted like wire. But what the federal forensics teams discovered when they analyzed the structural architecture of the radiology suite is what caused the entire hospital basement to be permanently encased in concrete within 48 hours. The creature hadn't escaped through the hospital hallways or the public doors. The investigators found a jagged, 2-foot-wide hole ripped directly through the reinforced concrete floor beneath the examination table, cutting straight into the heavy-duty industrial ventilation and utility shafts that ran vertically through the building's foundations. And when the technicians lowered an inspection camera deep into the darkness of the shaft, they discovered that the internal concrete walls of the hospital's primary infrastructure were completely covered in thousands of the long, 5-fingered claw marks. The entity hadn't just materialized in the mountains that winter. It had been utilizing the deep, unmapped utility labyrinths beneath the city's modern medical centers for years, traveling through the subterranean concrete veins completely undetected, living right beneath the feet of thousands of patients and doctors. Furthermore, when the scientists analyzed the digital backup of the X-ray on Austin's terminal, they realized the secondary skeletal column inside Garrett's body wasn't a biological growth. The density analysis showed that the stone-like ridges were designed to absorb extreme environmental pressure, meaning the entity was naturally built to survive at depths miles beneath the Earth's crust, and it was slowly adapting its biology to walk among humanity on the surface. The hospital administration permanently condemned the lower radiology wing 3 weeks after the incident. A specialized engineering crew used industrial cement mixers to fill the entire basement level with 80 tons of liquid concrete, sealing the utility shafts and erasing the suite from the facility's blueprints. Austin Vance never processed another medical scan, and he never entered a hospital again. He resigned from his radiology career, sold his home in Colorado, and relocated to a small, single-story ranch house in the flat, sun-baked desert of eastern New Mexico, a place with no basements, no complex building infrastructures, and absolutely no underground utility networks. He managed to build a quiet, daytime routine as a local delivery driver, but the psychological scars of that December night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to go near any large corporate buildings, he cannot tolerate dark, enclosed spaces, and he keeps a high-powered tactical lantern burning in his bedroom every single night. Because, according to Austin, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's black, glassy eyes. The true horror lives in the realization of what is walking right next to us. Every time he sees someone tilt their head slightly or hears a faint, rhythmic clicking sound from an air conditioning vent in a grocery store, his entire body goes completely cold. He realizes that humanity is just living in a fragile illusion of health and safety, entirely unaware that deep within the solid, modern structures of our world, something impossible is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the next scan to begin. The job of a night shift emergency dispatcher is a constant exercise in managing chaos. When you sit in that dimly lit room, surrounded by glowing monitor screens and the low hum of radio static, you are the first line of defense for people facing the worst moments of their lives. You train yourself to handle panic, screaming, and high-stakes crises with a calm, methodical focus. But for 34-year-old veteran dispatcher Nathan Briggs, a late-night call coming into the emergency dispatch center in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the winter of 2019 would shatter his understanding of a standard emergency. He would discover that a routine call for help could trace back to a physical impossibility, and that some voices are calling from places where no living human should ever be. The setting for this story is the historic industrial district of Southside Flats in Pittsburgh. It was the 24th of February 2019, a night where a bitter, freezing rain had coated the city bridges in a treacherous layer of black ice, and a thick, icy river fog had rolled in off the Monongahela River. The air outside was heavy, wet, and freezing, but inside the communications center, the atmosphere was completely tense, smelling of ozone from the computer servers and stale coffee. Nathan had been a dispatcher for 9 years. He was a practical, highly disciplined guy who handled high-pressure calls with a steady, robotic efficiency, completely devoid of any belief in supernatural events or urban legends. To him, every call had a logical explanation, a specific location, and a practical solution. Around 2:15 a.m., the chaotic rush of weather-related car accidents had finally begun to slow down, leaving the dispatch floor in a brief, heavy silence. Nathan rubbed his eyes, leaning back in his ergonomic chair, when a new line flashed red on his primary console screen. He clicked his headset button, delivering his standard greeting. The audio feed was filled with an intense, high-pitched static that rasped against his headset speakers, but underneath the distortion, Nathan could hear a sound that made his posture stiffen. It was a voice. It sounded like a man, his tone incredibly flat, distant, and mechanical, repeating a single phrase over and over again. "Help me. I am stuck. It is dark." The intonation never changed. It did not rise or fall, sounding less like a person in distress and more like a low-quality audio recording playing on a loop. Nathan immediately opened his digital mapping software, checking the automated cellular triangulation data that generated with every incoming 911 call. The digital map zoomed into the historic district, flashing a precise green pin over an old, decommissioned railroad overpass near an abandoned steel foundry. Nathan instructed the caller to give a specific landmark or explain how he became trapped. The caller did not answer the question directly. The voice simply repeated the exact same phrase, but this time the audio static on the line grew louder, and Nathan could hear a secondary sound backgrounding the voice. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise. It sounded exactly like bone chattering against bone at an impossible speed. Click, 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 click. Nathan frowned, typing a rapid message to dispatch a local police unit to inspect the overpass coordinates. 2 on-duty patrol officers, located just 3 blocks away, responded to the call and arrived at the dark, fog-shrouded overpass within 4 minutes. Nathan kept the open line active, listening to the static while communicating with the officers over the primary radio channel. The officers parked their cruiser, pulled out their high-powered tactical flashlights, and began searching the perimeter of the massive concrete and brick support pillars that held up the rusted iron train tracks above. The officers radioed back, stating that the area was completely deserted. There were no vehicles, no footprints in the freezing mud, and no signs of anyone hiding in the brush. Nathan looked back at his mapping screen. The GPS triangulation data had just refreshed, increasing its accuracy to a radius of less than 3 feet. The green pin was flashing directly on top of the largest solid brick support pillar, a massive 20-foot-tall historical column built in the early 1900s, constructed out of solid, reinforced layers of paving brick and poured concrete. Nathan told the officers to check the brick pillar itself, explaining that the caller's phone signal was registering exactly inside the structure. The officers approached the massive brick column, their tactical flashlight beams illuminating the wet, dark red masonry. They stepped up to the smooth face of the wall, leaning their ears against the cold brickwork. The primary officer keyed his radio microphone, his voice trembling slightly. He told Nathan that he could hear the static from the open cell phone call. The sound wasn't coming from a hidden speaker, and it wasn't an echo from the ravine. The flat, mechanical voice and the dry, rapid clicking sound were vibrating directly out from the center of the solid brick wall. The officer on the scene frantically slammed his palm against the heavy masonry, his breath frosting in the freezing river fog as he shouted into the brickwork. From the center of the column, the mechanical loop answered back, vibrating through the solid structures of the bridge. "Help me! I am stuck! It is dark!" Nathan sat frozen at his dispatch console, his headset pressed tightly against his ears. On his screen, the phone line remained wide open, the digital timer ticking upward, a direct bridge to a physical impossibility. The backup officer pulled a heavy steel crowbar from the trunk of the cruiser, running back to the column. He drove the chiseled end of the iron tool directly into the mortar line between two dark red bricks, throwing his entire weight against the handle. The ancient mortar fractured, spitting white dust into the damp air as a single brick was pried loose and dropped onto the frozen mud. The moment the brick fell away, exposing the interior layer of solid concrete, the mechanical voice on Nathan's headset instantly cut off. The silence that followed on the radio channel was total, absolute, and suffocating. Then, through the small gap where the brick had been removed, came a new sound. It wasn't the flat voice. It was a sharp, rapid, dry clicking noise, exploding out of the breach with a deafening volume that picked up on the officer's body microphones. Click, 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 click. The brickwork around the hole began to fracture violently from the inside out, spiderwebbing across the face of the 20-foot pillar as if an immense hydraulic pressure was building within the solid concrete center. The officers recoiled, dropped their tools, and drew their tactical sidearms, training their weapon lights onto the buckling column. A long, gray, emaciated arm shot out from the fracturing brickwork, its double-jointed wrist snapping with a dry, biological crack as it forced its way into the open air. The flesh was a dull, leathery color, glistening with a thick, clear fluid that began to drip onto the mud, smelling intensely of copper and ancient stone rot. The multi-jointed fingers, ending in long black claws, dug straight into the exterior bricks, tearing the heavy clay blocks apart like paper as the entity began to haul its 7-foot frame out of the solid column. The primary officer fired 3 successive rounds into the breach, the muzzle flashes illuminating the thick fog. The bullets struck the stone, but the entity simply unfolded its long limbs from the structural core of the bridge, its thin neck elongated and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle. Its upside-down face was fully revealed in the glare of the flashlight beams, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing jagged calcified ridges as it fixed its 2 massive glassy black orbs onto the retreating men. The officers didn't wait to see more. They sprinted back to their cruiser, threw the vehicle into reverse, and tore out of the ravine, their tires screaming against the frozen gravel as they broadcast an emergency officer needs assistance call over the primary channel. Nathan sat at his console, listening to the chaotic screams over the radio as the line finally went dead. At 4:30 a.m., a massive tactical response team consisting of state police units and federal structural engineers secured the perimeter of the Southside overpass, closing down all train traffic on the lines above. When the specialized team approached the brick pillar under the pale gray light of dawn, the entity was completely gone. The industrial ravine was dead silent, the heavy river fog clinging to the rusted iron girders. The massive brick column, however, showed the true extent of the violence. The exterior layer of masonry had been completely shredded from the center out, leaving a jagged 3-foot-wide chasm right through the core of the pillar. But what the federal forensics technicians discovered when they inserted an industrial fiber optic camera deep into the internal concrete core is what caused the entire railroad line to be permanently condemned under an immediate national security protocol. The pillar wasn't a solid block of concrete. The structural camera revealed that a highly complex, microscopic network of porous, honeycomb-like passages ran through the entire foundational concrete of the city's overpasses channels that had been chemically dissolved over decades, worn smooth by a thick, acidic fluid. The entity hadn't been trapped inside the brick wall. It had been traveling through the infrastructure of the city itself, utilizing the solid concrete pillars as a massive, hidden highway system to move beneath the streets of Pittsburgh completely undetected. Furthermore, when the technicians retrieved the caller's phone, which was found resting deep inside the central core of the pillar, they realized the phone didn't belong to a missing person. The digital diagnostics showed that the device had been manufactured in 2018, but the internal hardware had been completely modified, its circuit boards rewired and fused together with strings of dry, calcified organic tissue, allowing the entity to manipulate the cellular frequency using the rhythmic clicking of its own teeth. The Department of Transportation permanently demolished the historic railroad overpass 3 weeks after the incident. A specialized engineering crew used controlled explosives to collapse the entire brick and concrete foundation inward before pouring 80 tons of reinforced liquid industrial cement over the site, burying the entrance to the underground grid beneath a permanent barrier. Nathan Briggs never worked another closing shift at the emergency dispatch center. He resigned from his position, sold his home in Pennsylvania, and relocated to a small, single-story ranch house in the flat, sun-baked plains of eastern New Mexico, a place where the structures are built on simple concrete slabs with no pillars, no basements, and absolutely no old brickwork. He managed to build a quiet, daytime routine as a security monitor, but the psychological weight of that February night remains entirely unhealed. He refuses to go near old stone buildings, he cannot tolerate the sound of radio static, and he uses an electronic noise-canceling system in his bedroom just to sleep. Because according to Nathan, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true horror lives in the realization of what is happening inside the very structures that hold up our lives. Every time he hears a faint, muffled hum from a passing train or feels a slight vibration through a concrete floor, his body goes completely cold. He realizes that humanity is just living on a thin, fragile crust of reality, completely unaware that inside the solid, untouched foundations of our modern world, something else is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the next call to connect. The draw of exploring the vast, untouched wilderness of the American West is that it promises a complete escape from the constant digital noise of modern society. When you step off the paved roads and hike into the dense national forests, you are willingly trading cell service and high-speed internet for absolute solitude. For most people, this is a liberating experience, but it also means that if something goes wrong, you are entirely cut off from help. For 29-year-old freelance software developer and avid hiker Elijah Vance, a solo backpacking trip through the rugged mountains of northern Idaho in the autumn of 2018 would turn into a bizarre, bone-chilling mystery. He would discover that sometimes, even when you are miles away from civilization, a digital signal can find you, and a simple online notification can become a harbinger of pure terror. The setting for the story is the Clearwater National Forest, a massive, isolated wilderness characterized by steep, timber-covered ridges, deep granite gorges, and hundreds of miles of densely overgrown trails. It was the 14th of October 2018, a day where a sudden mountain cold front had pushed down from Canada, dropping the temperature into the low 30s and leaving a thin, ghostly mist hovering just above the forest floor. The air was incredibly crisp, smelling of damp pine needles, freezing riverstone, and the faint, cold scent of oncoming mountain snow. Elijah was an experienced outdoorsman who routinely took one-week solo trips to clear his mind from his intense coding schedule. He carried a heavy-duty tactical backpack, a high-powered aluminum flashlight, and a modern satellite communication device that allowed him to log his coordinates for safety. He was a deeply logical, numbers-driven guy who viewed the world through a lens of strict technology and facts, completely devoid of any belief in ghost stories or internet lore. Around 3:45 p.m., Elijah was navigating an unmapped rocky ridge about 8 miles deep into an isolated valley known as the Dead Man Creek Basin. The sun was dipping behind the jagged peaks, plunging the valley floor into a heavy, dark purple twilight that felt intensely quiet and oppressive. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic crunch of his own hiking boots, fracturing the frozen frost on the dirt path, and the heavy, controlled sound of his breathing. As he reached a narrow switchback near a steep limestone bluff, Elijah noticed a dark, horizontal opening in the base of the rock wall. The fissure was partially obscured by overgrown ferns and dry winter brush. A steady, freezing draft of air was blowing out from the gap, indicating a massive, hidden subterranean cave system extended deep into the mountain. Curious, Elijah set his backpack down, pulled out his powerful tactical flashlight, and decided to take a quick look inside the opening before setting up his camp for the evening. He squeezed his body through the narrow gap, his jacket tearing slightly against the sharp stone, until the ceiling suddenly vaulted upward into a wide, pitch-black gallery exactly 30 feet below the surface. The temperature inside the chamber dropped instantly, turning bone-chillingly cold. The atmosphere was completely stagnant, heavy, and smelled sharply of copper, oxidized iron, and ancient rotting clay. For nearly 20 minutes, Elijah walked through the pristine stone passage, using his bright white flashlight beam to guide his steps over the smooth river pebbles on the floor. The light cut through the heavy mist, creating a tiny circle of safety in the absolute dark. At exactly 4:12 p.m., Elijah reached the very back of the gallery, where the passage tapered inward and terminated in a solid wall of jagged limestone. He shined his light along the rock face, but as he turned around to head back toward the entrance, his high-powered flashlight suddenly flickered twice and died completely, plunging the entire cavern into an absolute, suffocating blackness. Elijah stopped walking. The silence inside the cave became total, absolute, and physical, so heavy that he could hear the frantic rushing of the blood in his own ears. He didn't panic. He figured the cold cave air had simply drained the battery. He reached into his pocket to pull out his smartphone, intending to use the screen's backlight to find his way out. He pressed the power button, and the screen illuminated his face in a pale blue glow. As the display turned on, Elijah's breath caught sharply in his throat. Even though he was 30 feet underground and miles away from the nearest town, the signal bar in the top corner of his phone screen was fully illuminated, showing a strong 5-bar connection to a high-speed network. Before his brain could process how this was technologically possible, a loud, sharp notification ping shattered the absolute silence of the cave. A digital map application on his phone had just sent an automated push notification asking him to rate his experience at his current location. Elijah frowned, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened the application. The screen displayed a localized map, but instead of showing the name of the national forest, the map showed a single, unnamed black circle right where he was standing. Then, from the absolute darkness at the terminal wall behind him, came a sound. It wasn't a shifting rock, and it wasn't the wind. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise. It sounded exactly like bone chattering against bone at an impossible speed, vibrating through the empty stone vault with a terrifying clarity. Click, 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 click. Elijah froze, his logical mind completely fracturing. He slowly raised his phone, directing the pale blue light of the screen toward the terminal wall. Emerging from the shadows, fully caught in the blue glare, was a face. It was immeasurably long and emaciated, its gray, leathery skin stretched so tight over the skull that the white bone structure underneath was visible through the flesh. It had no nose, no ears, and its unhinged jaw was wide open, sliding rhythmically from side to side to create that horrific clicking sound. But what made Elijah's blood turn to ice were the eyes. They were two massive, glassy, black orbs that completely reflected the blue light of his phone screen, staring straight into his eyes. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang completely upside down between its broad shoulders. Before Elijah could move, the creature launched its 7-foot frame forward, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its body across the river pebbles with an insect-like velocity, heading straight toward the space where he was standing. Elijah scrambled backward, his boots losing traction on the smooth river pebbles as he threw himself toward the narrow entrance fissure. He squeezed his body through the stone gap in a frenzy of pure adrenaline, ignoring the sharp rocks tearing through his shirt, and tumbled out into the freezing twilight of the Dead Man Creek Basin. He didn't stop to grab his tactical backpack. He sprinted blindly down the mountain switchback, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The ghostly mist had turned thick and heavy, swallowing the pine ridges in an absolute whiteout gloom. Behind him, from the mouth of the dark cave, came a horrific crashing sound. The entity had burst through the narrow opening. It wasn't running like a human. It was moving entirely on all fours, its long, double-jointed limbs striking the frozen dirt with a rapid, rhythmic thud. Thump, 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 thump. The creature was closing the distance with an insect-like velocity, its upside-down head twitching from side to side as that dry, rhythmic chattering of bone against bone echoed through the dark timber. Elijah ran for nearly 3 hours through the pitch-black wilderness, completely lost, his legs burning, guided only by the primal instinct to survive. By the time he finally collapsed from exhaustion, he was at the edge of an old logging road. He hid inside a hollow cedar stump until dawn, his phone clutched in his bleeding hands, completely paralyzed by the fear that the gray thing was still circling the perimeter. When a passing U.S. Forest Service truck found Elijah at 7:30 a.m., he was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and unfocused, and he was completely unable to speak a coherent sentence. The Rangers transported him to the Clearwater Valley Hospital in Orofino, where doctors treated him for severe hypothermia, physical exhaustion, and deep psychological shock. His family arrived at the hospital later that evening, deeply relieved but completely baffled by what happened next. While Elijah was lying semi-conscious in his hospital bed, his close friend and emergency contact, who had stayed behind in Boise, received a bizarre notification on his computer. The notification came from Elijah's public online mapping profile. Exactly 3 days after Elijah had been rescued from the logging road, a new public review was uploaded to the digital map application for the Dead Man Creek Basin. The review consisted of a single star and a short, hand-typed description. The text read, "The air is very cold down here. You left your bag. We are using your phone now." The Clearwater National Forest authorities, accompanied by 2 Idaho State Police deputies, launched a full search of the basin over the following weekend to retrieve Elijah's missing tactical backpack. When the search team located the hidden limestone fissure at the base of the bluff, they discovered a series of disturbing physical anomalies. The narrow opening had been violently widened from the inside out. The ancient stone fractured into a jagged 3-foot-wide chasm covered in deep, parallel gouge marks that had cut straight through the rock face. Elijah's backpack was sitting just inside the entrance, but every single zipper had been cleanly sliced open, and his high-powered aluminum flashlight had been twisted into a tight metallic knot. Furthermore, when trackers attempted to follow the line of the creature's claw prints inside the cavern, they found that the passage didn't lead to a dead-end wall. The team discovered that the terminal wall had collapsed, exposing a network of deep, horizontal burrows dug directly into the vertical clay banks of an underground aquifer that connected straight to the Clearwater River system. These tunnels measured barely 2 feet in diameter, meaning the entity had been navigating the entire park system completely unseen using these subterranean waterways. The Idaho State authorities permanently closed the Dead Man Creek Basin Trail Loop 3 weeks later, citing hazardous terrain conditions and a sudden spike in local wildlife aggression. The trail was removed from all official forestry maps, and the entrance was blocked by heavy timber barricades. Elijah Vance never went backpacking again. He resigned from his software developer position, sold his home in western Idaho, and moved his family to a modern high-rise concrete apartment complex in downtown Las Vegas, Nevada, a place where the terrain is completely flat, the desert sun bakes the earth dry, and the artificial lights never turn off. He managed to recover his physical routine, but the psychological scars of that October night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to enter any dark spaces, he will not go near bodies of water, and he keeps every light in his home turned on 24 hours a day. Because according to Elijah, the true terror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true terror lives in the realization of how deceptive the world truly is. Every time he looks out a window at night or watches a shadow shift in a corner, his body goes cold. He realizes that you can be completely in control of your life, moving forward with absolute confidence, entirely unaware that just outside the tiny circle of your safety, something impossible is standing in the dark, watching you, and waiting for your light to go out. The appeal of modern adventure vlogging is that it allows regular people to share the thrill of discovery in real time. When you strap a high-definition action camera to your chest and hike into the remote corners of the world, your audience gets to experience every breathtaking view and every sudden scare exactly as you do. It creates a powerful sense of connection, but it also records a permanent, unedited log of your reality. For 24-year-old content creator and backcountry hiker Caleb Cross, a solo video project in the rugged mountains of northern Arizona in the winter of 2018 would turn into a horrifying demonstration of this reality. He would discover that a digital camera doesn't just record memories. Sometimes it captures a living nightmare that lasts only 3 seconds, but changes your life forever. The setting for this story is the Coconino National Forest, a massive wilderness characterized by deep volcanic canyons, steep ponderosa pine ridges, and ancient limestone sinkholes. It was the 14th of November 2018, a day where a brutal winter freeze had pushed down from the peaks, dropping the temperature into the low 20s and leaving the forest floor covered in a crisp, icy layer of frost. The air was incredibly sharp, smelling of frozen pine sap, cold stone, and dead winter grass. Caleb was an experienced solo hiker who ran a moderately successful travel channel online. He was a practical, tech-savvy guy who viewed the forest as a backdrop for his creative work, completely devoid of any belief in urban legends or paranormal stories. He carried a heavy-duty tactical backpack, a top-of-the-line chest-mounted action camera, and a high-powered aluminum flashlight that could slice through the thickest darkness. Around 4:45 p.m., Caleb was exploring an unmapped basalt ravine about 5 miles away from the primary scenic overlook trail. The sun was dipping below the canyon rim, plunging the valley floor into a deep purple twilight that felt intensely heavy and quiet. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic crunch of his own hiking boots, fracturing the frozen pine needles, and the cold sound of his breathing. As he navigated a narrow, rocky ledge, Caleb noticed a dark fissure in the base of a vertical stone wall. The opening was about 4 feet wide, dropping straight down into a deep subterranean cavern chamber. Caleb felt a familiar surge of excitement, realizing this hidden cave would make excellent footage for his next video upload. He adjusted his chest camera, turned on his primary high-powered flashlight, and lowered himself through the gap, his boots sliding against the slick, frozen limestone until he reached the solid floor of the upper chamber exactly 20 feet below the surface. The air inside the cavern dropped instantly, turning bone-chillingly cold. The atmosphere was completely stagnant, heavy, and smelled sharply of copper, oxidized iron, and ancient rotting clay. For nearly 40 minutes, Caleb walked through the pristine stone passages, talking into his microphone and pointing his bright flashlight at the spectacular white mineral deposits on the walls. The blue-white beam cut through the heavy mist, creating a tiny circle of safety in the absolute dark. At exactly 5:32 p.m., Caleb reached a long, narrow gallery that resembled a forgotten subway tunnel. The floor was covered in smooth, dark river pebbles, and the passage tapered inward until it terminated in a solid wall of jagged limestone. Caleb walked to the very back of the gallery, stopping about 15 feet away from the terminal wall. He turned his body toward the center of the dark room, holding his flashlight up to illuminate the space, and began speaking his closing monologue to the camera lens. As he finished speaking, the high-powered aluminum flashlight in his hand suddenly flickered twice, its bright white beam dimming down to a pale, useless yellow glow before dying out completely. plunging the entire subway-like gallery into an absolute, suffocating darkness. Caleb stopped talking. The silence inside the cave became total, absolute, and physical, so heavy that he could hear the frantic rushing of the blood in his own ears. He didn't panic. He figured the cold winter air had simply drained the flashlight's lithium battery. He raised his hand to his chest, tapping the manual power switch on his action camera to activate its small built-in infrared night vision light, allowing him to see a faint, green-hued preview of the room on the small digital screen. As the camera sensor adjusted to the dark, the small preview screen rendered the green image of the terminal wall. Caleb's breath caught sharply in his throat. Crouching flat against the jagged limestone, fully caught in the center of the green camera display, was a shape. The anatomy was completely wrong. It was a towering skeletal entity, its body so emaciated that its ribs and elongated spine pushed sharply against its skin like jagged ridges. The flesh was a dull, leathery, bruised gray color, completely hairless, and glistened with a thick, clear fluid. Its double-jointed limbs were twice the length of a normal human's, its long arms ending in multi-jointed fingers with sharp black claws that were buried deep into the gravel floor. But it was the head that made Caleb's blood turn to ice. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang completely upside down between its broad shoulders. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull. But where the eyes should have been, the infrared sensor had caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of two massive, glassy black orbs. The creature was staring straight into the camera lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums. Then, the digital timer on Caleb's camera screen ticked forward. Second one. The creature slowly shifted its weight, launching its 7-foot frame off the limestone wall, its long limbs propelling its body across the river pebbles with an insect-like velocity. Second 2. The entity closed the 15-foot distance instantly, its upside-down face filling the entire green frame of the camera display, its unhinged jaw twitching rapidly as a low, rapid, dry clicking noise, the chattering of bone against bone, burst from its throat. Second 3. The creature raised a long skeletal arm, its black claws snapping shut directly over the camera housing, and the small digital screen exploded into green static before going completely black. Caleb screamed, a raw sound of pure survival panic, and threw his upper body backward into the dark. The action camera was violently ripped from its chest harness, the fabric tearing away as the entity snatched the device into the absolute blackness. He did not try to find his flashlight, and he did not look for his gear bag. He turned on his heel and sprinted blindly down the narrow subway-like tunnel, his hiking boots skidding wildly over the smooth river pebbles. The gallery was a claustrophobic trap of pitch blackness. Caleb had to rely entirely on his hands, scraping his palms against the cold, wet limestone walls to maintain his balance as he ran. The air inside the passage had instantly turned hot and suffocating, thick with that sharp, copper-like stench of old rot and stagnant water that coated his throat with every frantic gasp. Behind him, from the terminal wall, the sound of the pursuit started. It was a heavy, fluid, four-legged scrambling that vibrated right through the stone floor. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was moving on all fours, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its emaciated body across the rocks at an impossible speed, tracking the heavy sound of his boots. Caleb reached the base of the 20-foot drop where he had entered the cave system. The faint, dark purple twilight from the surface fissure filtered down, illuminating the vertical stone walls and the narrow opening above. He grabbed the jagged edges of the limestone wall, his fingers clawing at the frozen rock as he desperately tried to haul his body upward. His boots slipped against the slick stone, his fingernails splitting and bleeding as he fought for leverage. Below him, the rapid scrambling stopped. Caleb paused for a fraction of a second, looking straight down into the black abyss of the lower chamber. The creature was standing right at the base of the wall, its 7-foot frame fully silhouetted by the dim light from the surface. It slowly tilted its hairless skull back, its thin neck elongated and twisted at that horrific 90-degree angle. Its two massive, glassy black orbs locked onto his eyes, and its unhinged jaw slid open. Then, the creature opened its mouth wide, and a sound came out. It wasn't a gurgling hiss, and it wasn't the chattering of bone. It was Caleb's own voice, using the exact tone, pitch, and cadence of his closing video monologue, repeating his own words back to him in a dead mechanical loop. The sheer psychological terror of hearing his own voice coming out of that impossible mouth broke Caleb's paralysis. With a frantic, adrenaline-fueled cry, he threw his upper body forward, wedging his torso through the narrow surface fissure and clawed his way out onto the frozen ground of the basalt ravine. The freezing winter air hit his face, and the icy frost bit into his bleeding hands, but he didn't stop. He scrambled to his feet, running blindly through the dark ponderosa pines of the Coconino National Forest toward the primary access road 3 miles away. He dove into the front seat of his parked utility truck, slammed the door locks down, and tore away from the canyon rim, his hands shaking so violently he could barely keep the vehicle on the road. The Coconino County Sheriff's Office received Caleb's panicked report at approximately 7:15 p.m. He was hyperventilating, his clothes torn to shreds, and his face was completely devoid of color. The responding deputies, seeing the profound state of shock on the young content creator's face, organized a search and rescue team consisting of 4 armed officers and a forest ranger to secure the ravine at dawn. When the team arrived at the hidden fissure the following morning under a clear, freezing sky, the forest was completely quiet. The winter sun illuminated the basalt rocks, casting long, sharp shadows across the ravine. 2 deputies, armed with tactical shotguns and high-powered searchlights, lowered themselves into the sinkhole to retrieve Caleb's gear and inspect the cave. When they reached the terminal gallery, they found Caleb's tactical backpack sitting on the river pebbles, completely untouched. His action camera was lying 20 feet away near the back wall, its heavy-duty plastic housing cracked open, and its internal battery completely drained. But what the cyber forensics team discovered when they retrieved the camera's memory card back at the flagship station in Flagstaff is what caused the entire file to be placed under an immediate federal classification order. The memory card was fully intact. When the technicians developed the final video file, the clip lasted exactly 3 seconds before cutting to black. The footage showed the gray, emaciated entity launching itself off the limestone wall, its upside-down face filling the entire green frame of the infrared sensor. But when the digital analysts processed the audio track of those 3 seconds, running the sound through a high-definition filter, they discovered that beneath the loud clicking of the creature's teeth, the microphone had picked up a secondary, low-frequency signal. The signal wasn't a natural acoustic echo. It was a digital encryption sequence that had targeted the camera's wireless receiver, broadcasting a short, repeating line of data that translated into a precise set of GPS coordinates. The coordinates didn't point to the cave in Arizona. They pointed directly to the residential address of Caleb's parents' home in suburban Ohio, meaning the entity hadn't just attacked his camera, it had used the device's own network link to trace his identity back to the surface. The National Park authorities permanently closed the basalt ravine 3 weeks later. A specialized engineering crew used heavy machinery to pour tons of solid industrial concrete into the surface fissure, completely blocking the entrance and burying the cave beneath a permanent barrier of rock and cement. Caleb Cross never uploaded another video to his travel channel, and he never entered a forest again. He deleted his online accounts, sold his camera equipment, and relocated to a modern concrete high-rise apartment complex in downtown Miami, Florida, a place where the ground is covered in miles of solid asphalt, the buildings are constructed of steel and glass, and the artificial lights of the city never turn off. He managed to build a quiet, routine life as a digital graphic designer, but the psychological scars of that November afternoon remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to go near dark spaces, he cannot tolerate quiet rooms, and he leaves a high-powered lantern burning on his desk 24 hours a day. Because according to Caleb, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's black orbs. The true horror lives in the knowledge of how connected the dark truly is. Every time he sees a digital screen flicker or hears a faint, rhythmic chattering sound from a ventilation shaft in his office, his entire body goes completely cold. He realizes that humanity is just living in a tiny circle of modern technology, entirely unaware that just outside the edge of our lights, something impossible is watching through the screen, learning our secrets, and waiting for the signal to drop. The appeal of exploring old, abandoned civil defense systems is that they offer a tangible glimpse into a time when the entire nation was gripped by a deep collective paranoia. During the height of the Cold War, the government constructed thousands of massive, reinforced underground bunkers and drainage networks beneath major American cities, meant to keep humanity safe from an absolute catastrophe. Decades later, these spaces sit completely forgotten, hidden just beneath the pavement of our modern streets. But for 27-year-old urban explorer and civil engineer Julian Vance, a late-night descent into a historic storm vault beneath downtown Cincinnati, Ohio, in the spring of 2017 would turn into a masterclass in psychological survival. He would discover that the most terrifying part of entering a subterranean labyrinth isn't losing your way in the dark, it is realizing that you should never look up at the ceiling. The setting for this story is the underground drainage network beneath the Over-the-Rhine district in Cincinnati. It was the 14th of April, 2017, a night where a heavy Midwestern thunderstorm had just passed, leaving the city air thick, humid, and smelling of wet asphalt. Down inside the concrete vaults, however, the atmosphere was completely stagnant, freezing, and smelled heavily of damp clay, old iron rust, and ancient stone rot. Julian was a highly disciplined explorer. He didn't take reckless risks. He always carried a dual-battery tactical headlamp, a backup high-powered flashlight, and he left his exact entry coordinates with a close friend on the surface. He viewed these forgotten structures through a lens of architecture and history, completely empty of any superstitions or ghost stories. Around 11:15 p.m., Julian navigated his way through a massive rusted steel overflow valve located near an abandoned rail yard, stepping off his portable ladder onto the brick floor of a primary interceptor tunnel exactly 40 feet beneath the city streets. The only sound was the steady, rhythmic rushing of overflow water echoing from distant pipes and the slow, heavy drip of condensation striking the floor. Drip, pause, drip. For over 2 hours, Julian walked through these spectacular arched brick tunnels, taking structural measurements and documenting the unique 1950s masonry. The blue-white beam of his headlamp cut through the heavy mist, illuminating the smooth, wet walls and the old rusted safety ladders that led up to sealed manhole covers. At exactly 1:32 a.m., Julian entered a massive circular junction vault where 4 separate tunnels converged. The ceiling of this room vaulted upward into a magnificent 40-foot dome made of solid, reinforced concrete blocks. The floor was covered in a shallow layer of cold, slow-moving water that reached just above his ankles. Julian set his waterproof gear bag down on a raised concrete ledge, pulled out a digital thermal thermometer to log the ambient conditions, and decided to take a short rest before starting the long climb back to the surface. The silence in the massive dome was total, absolute, and suffocating. Then, from the darkness directly above his head, near the absolute center of the vaulted ceiling, came a sound. It wasn't the metallic ping of a water droplet, and it wasn't the groan of settling concrete. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise. It sounded exactly like bone chattering against bone at an impossible speed, vibrating through the empty dome with an immense rhythmic clarity. Click, 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 click. Julian froze, his muscles locking up instantly as his adrenaline spiked. His logical mind told him it was a swarm of bats, or perhaps a nesting raccoon that had found its way into the upper air vents. He slowly reached down to his belt, his hand shaking slightly as he gripped his secondary 500-lumen flashlight and snapped the bright white beam straight up into the center of the concrete dome. The brilliant light sliced through the darkness, and Julian's entire body went completely rigid. Crouching flat against the vertical concrete blocks, hanging completely upside down like a massive predatory insect, was an entity. It was impossibly tall, its emaciated torso compressed tight against the ceiling, its ribs and long, segmented spine pushing sharply against its skin like jagged ridges. Its flesh was a dull, leathery, bruised gray color, completely hairless and glistened with a thick, clear fluid that looked like liquid mucus. Its double-jointed limbs were twice the length of a normal man's, its long arms ending in multi-jointed fingers with sharp black claws that were dug deep into the narrow mortar seams of the concrete blocks. But it was the face that made the breath catch sharply in Julian's throat. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless skull to hang completely backward from its shoulders, staring straight down the vertical light beam directly into Julian's eyes. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull, but its face was dominated by two massive, glassy black orbs that completely reflected the glare of the flashlight. Its unhinged jaw was wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums as it chattered its teeth to create that deafening clicking sound. Julian stood perfectly paralyzed in the shallow water, the heavy aluminum flashlight trembling so violently in his grip that the circle of white light was dancing erratically across the creature's leathery chest. The creature didn't retreat from the light, and it didn't drop to the floor. It slowly shifted its weight, its black claws scraping against the concrete with a sharp, shattering sound as it began to crawl horizontally across the ceiling, moving with a fluid, terrifying velocity directly toward the space right above Julian's head. Julian broke through his paralysis with a breathless, panicked cry. He didn't try to retrieve his waterproof gear bag from the concrete ledge. He turned on his heel and bolted into the narrow, arched brick interceptor tunnel he had used to enter the junction, his heavy boots splashing violently through the ankle-deep water. The blue-white beam of his headlamp bounced frantically up and down, illuminating the sweating brickwork and the low-hanging lime deposits. The air in the tunnel felt instantly hot and suffocating, turning thick with that sharp, copper-like stench of old rot and stagnant sewer mud that coated his throat with every frantic gasp. Behind him, from the circular dome, came a sound that made his stomach drop. It wasn't the sound of something landing in the water. The entity was still on the ceiling. It was a rapid, four-legged scrambling, a succession of solid, wet impacts against the brick archway directly above him. Thump, 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 thump. The creature was moving upside down, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its emaciated body across the ceiling mortar with an absolute insect-like velocity, tracking the vibration of Julian's panicked run. A thick drop of the creature's clear fluid fell from the brick ceiling, striking Julian right on his shoulder. It burned slightly through his cotton shirt, smelling intensely of sulfur and old river clay. Julian pushed his legs to their absolute limit, his lungs screaming for oxygen. He reached the straight stretch of the interceptor line where the old rusted safety ladder led up to the overflow valve and his portable ladder. He grabbed the iron rungs, hauling his upper body out of the water, and began to climb with a frantic, adrenaline-fueled strength. He was 10 feet up, 15 feet up, his hands slipping against the wet rust of the bars. Suddenly, the rapid clicking sound from behind him stopped. Julian paused for a fraction of a second, his heart hammering so violently against his ribs he could hear it over the rushing water. He turned his head downward, directing the beam of his headlamp down into the dark vertical shaft. The entity had reached the base of the ladder. It didn't try to climb the rungs. It slowly tilted its hairless skull back, its two massive, glassy black orbs dilating as they absorbed the intense white light without a single blink. Then, with a sudden, fluid motion, it leaped straight onto the vertical brick wall of the shaft, its black claws digging deep into the ancient mortar as it began to scamper upward like a massive gecko, heading straight for his heels. Julian screamed, a raw sound of pure survival terror, and scrambled up the remaining rungs. He reached the narrow horizontal overflow valve, threw his torso through the opening, and tumbled onto the muddy gravel of the abandoned rail yard outside. The cool night air hit his face, and the distant rumble of the city streets felt like a lifeline. He didn't pull his portable ladder up. He scrambled to his feet, running blindly through the dark rail yard toward his utility truck parked under a street lamp a quarter-mile away. He dove into the front seat, locked the doors, and slammed his foot onto the accelerator, his body shaking so violently he could barely keep the vehicle in the center of the lane as he tore away from the over-the-Rhine district. The Cincinnati Police Department received Julian's panicked report at approximately 2:15 a.m. He was hyperventilating, his clothes torn, and his fingers were bleeding from the rusted iron rungs of the safety ladder. The responding officers, seeing the sheer state of shock on the young civil engineer's face, organized a tactical search team consisting of 4 armed officers and a city utility supervisor to secure the overflow valve at dawn. When the team arrived at the abandoned rail yard the following morning under a gray, overcast sky, the site was completely quiet. The storm had left the gravel tracks heavy with mist. 2 officers, armed with tactical shotguns and high-powered searchlights, lowered themselves into the overflow valve to inspect the interceptor tunnel and retrieve Julian's gear bag. When they reached the circular junction vault, they found Julian's waterproof bag sitting on the concrete ledge. The heavy nylon straps had been cleanly sliced through, and his digital thermal thermometer had been completely crushed into the brick floor, its internal circuitry pulverized into fine dust. But what the city engineering inspectors discovered when they used a high-powered structural camera to analyze the concrete dome of the vault is what caused the entire drainage section to be permanently sealed under an emergency public safety order. The 40-foot ceiling wasn't just old concrete. The structural camera revealed that the mortar seams between the concrete blocks had been systematically hollowed out from the inside. Something had spent years using its claws to carve a massive horizontal network of narrow crawlways inside the secondary ceiling insulation channels that were just wide enough for an emaciated, leathery body to slide through, completely hidden from the view of anyone standing on the floor below. The entity hadn't just chanced upon Julian that evening. It had been living inside the ceiling network of the city drainage system for decades, moving silently beneath the feet of thousands of downtown pedestrians, listening to the vibrations of the traffic, and waiting for someone to enter the junction alone in the dark. The city of Cincinnati permanently closed the over-the-Rhine overflow network 3 weeks later. A specialized construction crew used 10 tons of industrial concrete to seal the overflow valve completely, welding heavy steel plates over the entry points and erasing the vault from all active city engineering blueprints. Julian Vance never went urban exploring again. He resigned from his civil engineering firm, sold his property in Ohio, and moved to a small, single-story home in the flat, sun-baked plains of eastern New Mexico, a place where the terrain is completely level, the houses are built on solid concrete slabs with no basements, and the sky is a massive, unbroken expanse. He managed to build a quiet, routine life as a land surveyor, but the psychological scars of that April night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to enter any building with high, vaulted ceilings, he cannot tolerate dark rooms, and he keeps a high-powered lantern burning in his hallway every single night. Because, according to Julian, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true horror lives in the knowledge of what is hovering right above us. Every time he walks through a modern hallway or feels a cold draft drop down from a ceiling vent, his entire body goes completely rigid. He realizes that humanity is just walking through life with absolute confidence, entirely unaware that just a few feet above their heads, inside the hidden structures of the world, something impossible is sitting in the dark, chattering its teeth, and waiting for you to look up. The field of deep-sea marine biology is one of the most frustrating sciences on the planet. We have better maps of the surface of Mars than we do of our own ocean floor. When you are operating a research vessel miles away from the coast, lowering millions of dollars of delicate equipment into a black abyss that is miles deep, You are completely at the mercy of the elements. It is an environment of absolute pressure, freezing temperatures, and total darkness. But for 38-year-old oceanographer Raymond Vance, a deep-sea mapping expedition off the coast of Northern California in the spring of 2019 would throw his entire team into a state of pure psychological terror. They would find out that when you drop a camera into a trench where the sun has never shone, you might pull up a secret that science is too terrified to share with the world. The setting for this story is the Mendocino Fracture Zone, a massive, jagged, underwater canyon system that plunges over 10,000 feet into the Pacific Ocean bedrock. It was the 14th of May, 2019, a night where a massive Pacific storm had rolled over the research vessel, forcing the crew to secure the upper decks as 12-foot swells slammed against the hull. Inside the main laboratory cabin, the atmosphere was incredibly tense, smelling of stale coffee, ozone from the electronic racks, and the heavy dampness of the sea. Raymond was a highly respected researcher who had spent 15 years tracking deep-sea tectonic activity for a federal marine institute. He was a logical, data-driven man who viewed the ocean as a machine to be studied, completely devoid of mythical sea monsters or old sailor superstitions. Along with him in the dark cabin were two colleagues, an acoustics technician named Ethan and a remote vehicle operator. Around 10:15 p.m., the team was utilizing a heavy, armored deep-sea submersible camera platform called the Abyssus 4. The platform was suspended by a heavy, steel-reinforced fiber optic cable dangling exactly 9,500 feet below the surface, right along the vertical rock face of the underwater canyon. At exactly 10:32 p.m., the submersible's high-definition video feed, which was being projected onto a large monitor screen in the center of the cabin, began to suffer from severe electromagnetic interference. Horizontal lines of green static rippled across the display, obscuring the image of the jagged basalt rock walls. Raymond leaned forward, tapping the edge of the metal console, telling Ethan to check the cable tension. Ethan checked the digital gauges and shook his head, his face turning pale under the fluorescent cabin lights. The tension was perfectly normal, but the acoustic hydrophone, the ultra-sensitive underwater microphone mounted to the camera frame, was picking up a massive spike in low-frequency audio. Ethan turned up the volume on the laboratory's main monitor speakers. At first, there was only the deep, rhythmic, rushing sound of the ocean current. But as Raymond stepped closer to the speakers, the rushing sound was replaced by a sound that made his stomach drop. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise. It sounded exactly like bone chattering against bone at an impossible speed, vibrating through the deep water with an immense rhythmic clarity. Click, 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 click. Raymond frowned, stating that a sound like that at nearly 10,000 feet was a biological impossibility. Marine mammals couldn't survive the pressure at this depth, and deep-sea fish didn't possess the skeletal structures required to create a dry bone click. Before he could finish his thought, the remote operator let out a short gasp, pointing a shaking finger at the video monitor. The armored camera platform had drifted into a massive horizontal cavern opening in the canyon wall. The ultra-bright, high-intensity LED floodlights mounted to the frame cut through the black ocean water, illuminating the entrance of the cave. And standing right inside the mouth of the cavern, perfectly centered in the blue-white glare of the lights, was a shape. The creature was towering, its height estimated at well over 7 feet, but its torso was so emaciated that its rib cage and long segmented spine pushed sharply against its skin like jagged ridges. Its flesh was a dull, leathery, bruised gray color, completely hairless and glistened with a clear, thick fluid. Its double-jointed limbs were twice the length of a normal human's, its long arms ending in multi-jointed fingers with sharp black claws that were gripping the edge of the basalt rock face. But it was the head that made Raymond's heart give a violent, uncomfortable thud against his ribs. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang completely upside down between its broad shoulders. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull, but where the eyes should have been, the high-intensity floodlights caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of two massive, glassy black orbs. The entity was staring straight through the camera lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums as it chattered its teeth to create that deafening clicking sound. Raymond stood perfectly paralyzed in the dark cabin, the green static of the monitor illuminating his face, his mind completely fractured. The creature was living at a depth where the pressure would instantly crush a human being into a pulp, yet its body was completely intact, moving with a fluid, terrifying grace. The creature didn't retreat into the cave. It slowly shifted its weight, launching its 7-foot frame off the rock face, its long limbs propelling its body through the freezing water with an insect-like velocity, heading straight toward the suspended camera platform. Raymond screamed at the remote operator to winch the camera up, his voice cracking with pure survival panic. The operator slammed his hand onto the emergency hoist control, and the heavy electric motor on the upper deck roared to life, the steel-reinforced fiber optic cable groaning under the sudden, immense strain as it began to pull the platform back up toward the surface. Through the video monitor, despite the heavy horizontal bands of green static, Raymond watched the entity close the distance. It swam with an impossible erratic motion, its long, double-jointed limbs cutting through the black ocean water like the legs of a giant aquatic spider. Before the camera platform could rise 10 feet, the screen tilted violently. The creature had reached the frame. A long, gray, emaciated arm shot into the clear view of the lens, its black claws clamping around the heavy titanium housing of the upper floodlight. The metal groaned, a sound picked up by the hydrophone and broadcast into the quiet laboratory cabin as a deep, metallic screech. The creature pulled its face right up to the lens, its massive, glassy black orbs filling the entire screen, its unhinged jaw twitching rapidly as it blasted that dry, rhythmic bone clicking straight into the microphone. The sound was so incredibly loud, it blew out the audio amplifiers in the laboratory console, filling the room with a sharp, burning smell of electrical fire. Then, the entity brought its other hand down onto the fiber optic cable connection. The monitor screen went completely black. The digital telemetry data vanished, replaced by an error message that read, "Signal lost, physical disconnect." Outside the cabin, on the storm-tossed upper deck, the heavy winch let out a horrific, high-pitched scream as the steel-reinforced cable snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. The loose end of the cable whipped through the air, smashing a heavy glass searchlight on the superstructure before spinning uselessly out into the ocean. Raymond stood perfectly still in the middle of the dark laboratory, his hands gripping the edge of the console, his chest heaving as the 12-foot swells continued to slam against the ship's hull. He looked at Ethan, whose face was completely devoid of color, his hands shaking so violently he could barely hold his clipboard. The research vessel returned to the port of Eureka, California, 24 hours later, cutting the mapping expedition short due to severe equipment failure. Raymond immediately submitted his digital data logs and the partial video recording to the Regional Marine Institute director. Within 6 hours of their arrival, a team of 4 plainclothes officials from a federal science and security agency arrived at the port. They boarded the ship, confiscated the laboratory's primary hard drives, seized the remaining spools of fiber optic cable, and placed the entire crew under a strict federal non-disclosure agreement. The incident was officially logged in the public archives as a catastrophic deep-sea cable failure caused by an underwater landslide along the Mendocino Fracture Zone. But what the Marine Institute's Internal Review Board discovered before the files were completely locked away is what turned this scientific observation into a classified nightmare. The acoustics technician, Ethan, had managed to save a 3-second backup of the hydrophone audio onto an encrypted personal flash drive before the federal agents arrived. When Raymond and a senior marine biologist analyzed the audio frequency in a private facility weeks later, they discovered that the dry, rapid clicking sound wasn't a random biological noise. The pattern of the bone clicks matched the exact cadence of a highly complex mathematical binary code. When translated through a standard military decryption algorithm, the repeating message inside the entity's clicking didn't contain coordinates or geological data. The short, hand-scratched translation read, We are coming up. The federal agency permanently closed the marine coordinates around the Mendocino Cavern 3 months later, designating a 40-square-mile zone of the Pacific Ocean as a restricted military testing area, completely off-limits to commercial fishing, research vessels, and public navigation. Raymond Vance never boarded a research vessel again. He resigned from his Oceanographic Institute position, sold his home on the California coast, and relocated to a small, landlocked town in the high, arid plains of western Kansas, a place where the ground is flat dirt for hundreds of miles, the air is bone dry, and the nearest body of water is a shallow irrigation ditch. He managed to build a quiet, routine life as a high school earth science teacher, but the psychological scars of that May night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to go near lakes or swimming pools, he cannot tolerate dark, quiet spaces, and he leaves a high-powered lantern burning on his nightstand 24 hours a day. Because, according to Raymond, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the creature's upside-down face or the snapping of the steel cable. The true horror lives in the realization of what is hidden beneath the surface of our world. Every time he looks at a map of the ocean or hears a faint, rhythmic chattering sound from a heating vent in his classroom, his entire body goes completely rigid. He realizes that humanity is just sailing on a thin, fragile surface of comfort, completely unaware that miles below the waves, in the absolute dark and crushing pressure of the deep abyss, something impossible is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the tide to turn. The allure of commercial show caves is that they offer a perfectly sanitized version of the underground world. When you pay for a ticket at a state park or a private cavern attraction, you expect paved pathways, handrails, and bright, colorful lights illuminating the rock formations. It feels like a museum, completely safe and entirely controlled by the staff. But for 26-year-old seasonal tour guide Tristan Vance, a late-night closing shift at a popular show cave in southern Indiana in the summer of 2016 would reveal that a simple metal gate and a warning sign are not always enough to keep the unknown at bay. He would learn that when you hear a sound coming from a part of the cave that has been closed to the public for over 50 years, you do not go looking for the source. The setting for this story is the Squire Boone Caverns, located just outside of Corydon, Indiana. It was the 24th of August, 2016, a night where the Midwestern summer heat was intensely oppressive, making the air outside heavy with humidity and the smell of dry cornfields. Inside the caverns, however, the temperature sat at a constant, chilling 54 degrees, creating a thick, ghostly mist where the warm surface air met the cold breath of the subterranean tunnels. Tristan was a local college student who worked the summer shifts to pay for his tuition. He was a practical, easygoing guy who knew the history of the caverns by heart, from the early pioneers to the specific geological formations. He carried a standard-issue heavy plastic flashlight, a keyring with master passes, and a two-way radio clipped to his belt. He didn't believe in the ghost stories the older guides liked to tell the tourists. To him, the cave was just a job. Around 9:15 p.m., the last commercial tour group had exited the gift shop and the main entrance doors were locked. Tristan was tasked with the final sweep of the public trails, a routine procedure to ensure no stray tourists had stayed behind to take extra photos. He walked along the illuminated concrete pathway, turning off the massive breaker switches section by section, plunging the spectacular stalactite chambers into a deep, velvety darkness behind him. At exactly 9:42 p.m., Tristan reached the deepest section of the public route, a wide chamber known as the Rock of Ages. At the far back of this room, hidden away from the main path by a low limestone ledge, sat the entrance to the Forbidden Tunnel. It was a narrow, unpaved passage that led into an unstable, flooded network of the aquifer. The entrance was blocked by a heavy, rusted iron gate, secured with a thick chain and a bright red sign that read, "Danger, do not enter, collapse hazard." Tristan stood by the breaker panel, his hand resting on the final plastic switch that would turn off the lights for the entire lower chamber. The silence in the room was immense, total and absolute. broken only by the steady, rhythmic rush of an underground waterfall cascading into a deep pit somewhere nearby. Then, from the absolute darkness behind the rusted iron gate of the forbidden tunnel, came a sound. It wasn't the dripping of water, and it wasn't the low groan of settling stone. It was a voice. It sounded like a woman, her tone incredibly flat, distant, and mechanical, repeating a single phrase over and over again. "Help me, help me, help me." The intonation never changed. It didn't rise or fall, sounding less like a person in distress and more like a low-quality audio recording playing on a loop. Tristan froze, his heart giving a sudden, violent thud against his ribs. His first thought was that a tourist from the previous group had climbed over the limestone ledge, slipped past the gate, and fallen into the unstable shaft. He pulled his heavy flashlight from his belt, clicked the button, and directed the bright white beam straight through the iron bars of the gate. The white light cut through the heavy mist inside the tunnel, illuminating the muddy floor, the jagged limestone walls, and the rotting wooden supports from an old 1960s exploration project. The tunnel was completely empty. There was nobody there. Tristan stepped closer to the gate, his boots crunching loudly against the gravel. He pressed his face against the cold iron bars, shouting into the darkness, asking if anyone was hurt. The moment his voice echoed down the passage, the mechanical chanting stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Tristan held his breath, listening intently, his eyes scanning the wet clay floor inside the gate. He noticed a series of deep, parallel tracks in the mud, as if something heavy had been dragged backward into the dark recesses of the tunnel. Then, from about 30 feet deep inside the forbidden tunnel, past the reach of his flashlight beam, came a new sound. It was a sharp, dry, rapid clicking noise. It sounded exactly like bone chattering against bone at an impossible speed. Click, 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 click. And as Tristan watched in absolute, unadulterated horror, the two massive, glassy black orbs materialized out of the dark, hovering just 2 feet above the muddy floor. The creature was crouching on all fours, its gray, emaciated torso compressed flat against the ground, its thin neck twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle. Its upside-down face was staring directly into his flashlight lens, its unhinged jaw wide open as a clear, viscous fluid dripped from its calcified ridges into the mud. The creature didn't make a sound from its throat. It simply shifted its weight and launched its 7-foot frame forward, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its body through the narrow tunnel with an insect-like velocity, heading straight for the iron gate where Tristan was standing. Tristan did not think. He dropped his two-way radio, spun on his heel, and slammed his hand onto the final breaker switch. The entire lower chamber of the Rock of Ages was instantly plunged into a deep, pitch-black darkness, save for the single, trembling beam of his plastic flashlight. He bolted up the concrete pathway, his sneakers skidding violently against the wet, smooth surface. The handrails blurred past his left hand as he threw his body up the steep incline, his chest heaving with a frantic, desperate energy. Behind him, a horrific, metallic impact echoed through the chamber. Clang! The creature had slammed its 7-foot frame directly into the rusted iron gate. The sound of the thick chain snapping and the iron hinges tearing out of the ancient limestone wall reverberated off the cavern's ceiling like a gunshot. The entity was out of the forbidden tunnel. Now, the sound of the pursuit was closing the distance with terrifying speed. It was a rapid, four-legged scrambling, a succession of solid, wet impacts against the concrete trail. Thump, 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 thump. The creature's long, double-jointed limbs were propelling its emaciated body up the steep incline with an absolute insect-like velocity, completely unbothered by the slope. Tristan reached the stairs leading to the middle level, a narrow section where the trail twisted through a tight, low-ceilinged passage called the Needle's Eye. He ran with his head ducked down, his flashlight beam bouncing frantically off the wet stone walls. As he rounded a sharp bend, his foot caught the edge of a concrete step. He went down hard, sliding across the rough stone floor, his flashlight flying out of his hand and bouncing into a deep, flooded crevice beside the path. The light did not break. It settled at the bottom of the water, pointing upward, illuminating the entire narrow passage in a pale, ghostly blue-green glow. Tristan scrambled to get his feet under him, but his right knee was badly scraped and throbbing with a sharp, white-hot pain. He looked back down the steps. Crouching at the bottom of the short flight of stairs, fully caught in the upward glow of the submerged flashlight, was the entity. Its gray, leathery torso was compressed completely flat against the concrete, its thin neck elongated and twisted at that horrific 90-degree angle. Its upside-down face was fixed directly on Tristan's eyes, its unhinged jaw wide open as a thick, clear string of fluid dripped from its calcified ridges onto the path. The creature raised one of its long, skeletal arms, its black claws scraping against the concrete step with a slow, agonizing shriek. Screech. Then it opened its mouth wide and the voice came out again. It was the exact same flat, mechanical female tone Tristan had heard earlier, but this time it didn't say, "Help me." It repeated Tristan's own full name over and over in that identical dead loop. Tristan Vance. Tristan Vance. Tristan Vance. The sheer psychological terror of hearing his own name echoed back to him by an impossible entity broke Tristan's mind. With a breathless scream, he dragged his body upward using the steel handrails, forcing his injured leg to move as he lunged through the exit tunnel toward the upper level. He burst through the final security door into the back room of the commercial gift shop, slamming the heavy reinforced steel door shut behind him and throwing the deadbolt into place. He collapsed against the metal, his heart hammering so violently against his ribs he was certain it would give out. From the other side of the thick steel door came a single heavy thud. Thump. Then, the dry, rapid chattering of bone against bone echoed faintly through the metal frame, followed by the soft, wet sliding of flesh as the creature descended back into the dark depths of the public cavern. Tristan was found by the morning shift manager at 7:30 a.m., curled into a tight ball in the corner of the locked gift shop, his clothes covered in cave mud, his eyes wide, vacant, and completely unblinking. The Indiana State Police and the Harrison County Sheriff's Department launched a full investigation of the Squire Boone Caverns over the weekend. A tactical sweep team consisting of 4 armed officers and a subterranean safety engineer moved through the lower levels with high-powered searchlights and shotguns. When they reached the Rock of Ages chamber, they found the entrance to the Forbidden Tunnel completely open. The heavy iron gate had been ripped entirely off its mountings, the thick steel links of the chain snapped in half. But what the state cave inspectors discovered when they used a specialized high-resolution laser scanner to map the interior of the Forbidden Tunnel is what caused the entire lower section of the commercial park to be permanently condemned. The unpaved tunnel didn't just lead to an unstable aquifer, it connected to a massive vertical shaft that plunged hundreds of feet into the deep, unmapped foundations of the state's cave system. And when the technicians analyzed the laser imagery of the vertical shaft, they realized the limestone walls were completely covered in thousands of the long, 5-fingered claw marks. The tracks didn't just stay in the dark. When the police reviewed the audio from Tristan's dropped 2-way radio, which had recorded the entire incident from the floor of the chamber, they discovered that the mechanical female voice wasn't an audio loop. The frequency analysis showed that the creature was mimicking the exact vocal cords of a local high school student who had disappeared in the surrounding woods in the summer of 1985. Meaning the entity had been observing, learning, and waiting in the forbidden spaces of the park for over 30 years. The management of Squire Boone Caverns permanently sealed the entrance to the lower chambers 3 weeks later. A specialized engineering crew used 5 tons of industrial concrete to wall off the Rock of Ages chamber completely, erasing the Forbidden Tunnel from all future tourist maps and brochures. Tristan Vance never finished his college degree, and he never entered an underground structure again. He packed his clothes into his car, left the state of Indiana, and moved to a newly constructed concrete slab home in the high, sun-baked desert of Moab, Utah, a place where the ground is solid rock, the sun is blindingly bright, and there are absolutely no trees, no mist, and no caves. He managed to rebuild a quiet daytime routine, but the psychological scars of that August night remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to enter any building with a basement, he cannot tolerate the sound of a looping audio track, and he leaves every light in his home turned on 24 hours a day. Because according to Tristan, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true horror lives in the realization of what is listening to us. Every time he hears a distant, flat voice on a crowded street, or a faint, rhythmic chattering sound from a vent, his entire body goes completely rigid. He realizes that you can be completely safe, surrounded by family and modern comforts, entirely unaware that just a few feet away, behind a simple metal gate or a warning sign, something impossible is sitting in the absolute dark, learning your name and waiting for you to listen. The draw of exploring deep subterranean cave networks is that it forces you to confront a world that is completely alien to human existence. When you are hundreds of feet below the surface, the familiar rules of the upper world cease to apply. There is no concept of day or night, no cellular network, and no ambient warmth. If your main light source fails, the darkness that swallows you is so absolute that you can literally lose your sense of balance and direction within minutes. But for 34-year-old wilderness guide Austin Briggs, a solo exploration into an undocumented cavern in the rugged backcountry of southern Missouri in the autumn of 2015 would turn into a masterclass in psychological survival. He would discover that when you venture into the deepest, most isolated corners of the earth, the dark isn't always empty. The setting for this story is the Ozark National Scenic Riverways, a massive expanse of dense timber, steep limestone bluffs, and thousands of hidden, unmapped sinkholes. It was the 12th of October 2015, a day where the crisp autumn air was thick, smelling of dry oak leaves, damp moss, and the faint, cold scent of river limestone. Austin was a highly disciplined outdoorsman. He spent his free time mapping minor cave entries for a regional geology group, always carrying a tactical backpack, a heavy-duty 3-battery headlamp, and a secondary high-powered flashlight. He was a practical, level-headed guy who didn't believe in superstitions or campfire stories. To him, a cave was just an interesting rock formation, nothing more. Around 3:45 p.m., Austin was navigating a deep, rocky ravine about 5 miles off the main hiking trails when he noticed a small horizontal opening at the base of a towering limestone bluff. The fissure was partially obscured by a thick curtain of wild vines and overgrown ferns. A steady, freezing draft of air was blowing out from the gap, a clear sign that it connected to a massive, hidden underground chamber. Austin unbuckled his pack, pushed it ahead of him through the muddy opening, and squeezed his torso through the narrow gap. The sharp rock tore at his jacket, but after a few yards of tight crawling, the ceiling suddenly vaulted upward into a magnificent, pristine cavern. The air inside was dead, freezing, and heavy, registering at a constant 54 degrees. The only sound was the slow, rhythmic dripping of water striking the pebbles somewhere in the deep dark. Drip. Pause. Drip. For the next 2 hours, Austin moved deeper into the cave system, completely fascinated. He followed a dry, ancient underground riverbed that twisted through 3 massive chambers, each one larger and darker than the last. The blue-white beam of his headlamp cut through the heavy mist, illuminating majestic white stone pillars and ancient mineral deposits. At exactly 5:50 p.m., Austin reached a long, narrow gallery that resembled a subway tunnel. The floor was covered in smooth, dark river pebbles, and the walls tapered inward until they terminated in a solid wall of jagged stone. Austin set his backpack down on a dry, flat boulder, intending to take a quick rest before starting the long trek back to the surface. The silence in the room was total, absolute, and suffocating. Then, from the darkness at the very back of the gallery, about 30 feet ahead of him, came a sound. It wasn't a water droplet, and it wasn't a shifting rock. It was a slow, heavy, wet, sliding motion against the damp clay. Slide, pause. Slide, pause. It sounded exactly like someone dragging a massive sack of wet leather across the pebbles, Austin froze, his muscles locking up as his adrenaline spiked. He slowly raised his right hand, gripping his secondary high-powered flashlight, and snapped the 500-lumen beam straight toward the back wall. The brilliant white light sliced through the gloom, and Austin's entire body went completely rigid. Crouching right in the far corner of the terminal wall, fully illuminated by the glare, was an entity. It was impossibly tall, standing well over 7 feet, but its body was so emaciated that its ribs and elongated spine pushed sharply against its skin like jagged ridges. The flesh was a dull, waxy, bruised gray color, completely hairless, and glistened with a thick, clear fluid that looked like liquid mucus. Its double-jointed limbs were twice the length of a normal human's, its long arms dangling so low that its multi-jointed fingers, ending in sharp black claws, were buried deep into the gravel. But it was the head that made the breath catch sharply in Austin's throat. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang completely upside down between its shoulders. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull, but where the eyes should have been, the light beam caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of 2 massive, glassy black orbs. The creature was staring straight into the lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums. From deep within its throat came a low, rapid, dry clicking sound, the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone. Click, 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 click. Austin stood perfectly paralyzed, the heavy flashlight shaking so violently in his hand that the circle of white light was dancing erratically across the creature's leathery chest. His logical brain completely fractured. The creature didn't retreat from the light. It slowly shifted its weight, dragging its left limb forward with a heavy, solid impact against the stone. Thump, step, thump, step. It was moving directly into the center of the beam, its upside-down head twitching rhythmically from side to side as the clicking sound from its throat grew louder and louder, filling the entire silent gallery. Austin realized with absolute certainty that if he didn't move immediately, he would never see the sun again. With a breathless scream of pure survival panic, Austin dropped his secondary flashlight, turned around, and bolted down the narrow subway-like tunnel, running blindly back toward the mouth of the cave. Behind him, from the dark gallery, the rapid four-legged scrambling started. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was descending the slope, its long limbs propelling its emaciated body through the narrow passages with an insect-like velocity, tracking the heavy vibration of his escape. Austin sprinted through the dark, twisting passages, his heavy boots skidding wildly over the loose, damp stones of the ancient riverbed. The blue-white beam of his headlamp bounced frantically up and down, illuminating the sweating limestone walls and the massive white stalactites that seemed to reach down like teeth from the ceiling. The air in the cave had turned hot and suffocating, carrying that sharp, copper-like stench of old rot and stagnant water that filled his throat with every frantic gasp. Behind him, the sound of the pursuit was gaining ground. It was a heavy, fluid, four-legged scrambling that vibrated right through the stone floor of the tunnel. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was moving with an impossible, insect-like velocity, its long, double-jointed limbs propelling its emaciated body across the rocks without a single slip. Austin reached the second massive chamber, a vaulted room where the trail split into 2 different tunnels. In his panic, he couldn't remember which path led back to the entrance. He paused for a fraction of a second, his headlamp sweeping across the dark openings. That microsecond of hesitation almost cost him his life. From the tunnel behind him, the creature burst into the chamber. It didn't stay on the floor. With a sudden, terrifying leap, it launched its 7-foot frame onto the vertical limestone wall, its black claws digging deep into the stone with a sharp, shattering sound. It began to scamper horizontally across the rock face, heading straight for the archway where Austin was standing. Click, 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 click. Austin let out a breathless cry, dove to his right, and threw himself into the narrower of the 2 openings. He scrambled forward on his hands and knees as the ceiling dropped down to a height of just 4 feet, forcing him into a tight, claustrophobic trench. He could hear the creature arrive at the entrance of the trench behind him. Because of its massive 7-foot height, it couldn't immediately sprint into the narrow gap. It let out a high-pitched metallic shriek, a sound like iron tearing apart that echoed off the stone walls so loudly it shattered the lens of Austin's headlamp. The light died instantly. The world vanished into absolute pitch-black darkness. Austin froze, his chest pressed flat against the cold, damp mud of the trench floor. The silence that followed was total, suffocating, and heavy. He covered his mouth with both hands, trying to muffle the frantic, violent sound of his own breathing. He could hear the creature right at the mouth of the trench, just 10 feet away. It was unhinging its bones. The dry, rhythmic cracking of its joints echoed through the dark as it compressed its torso and shoulders inward, slowly sliding its emaciated body into the narrow opening. Scrape, slide, scrape. A thick, clear drop of its fluid fell from the ceiling of the trench, landing right onto the back of Austin's exposed neck. It was ice cold, smelling sharply of sulfur and old river clay. With no light and no space to run, Austin reached out into the dark, his fingers desperately searching the mud until they closed around a heavy, sharp limestone shard that had broken off the wall. He gripped the rock, holding it tight against his chest, preparing to fight for his life in the dark. Just as the copper smell became completely overwhelming and a low, wet wheeze vibrated through the air right next to his boots, a sudden bright beam of white light cut through the trench from the far end. A loud, booming voice echoed through the passage. A regional search and rescue team, accompanied by 2 backcountry rangers, had just entered the front chamber of the cave. Austin had left a detailed map of his entry coordinates on the dashboard of his truck at the trailhead, a standard safety protocol he never neglected. When his truck was found abandoned past the park's closing time, the rangers had immediately initiated a sweep of the ravine. The moment the powerful searchlights hit the interior of the trench, the entity recoiled. It let out another wet, gurgling hiss, pulled its long limbs backward out of the gap, and scrambled down into a deep, vertical drainage fissure in the floor of the second chamber, vanishing into the unmapped depths of the aquifer below. The rescue team pulled Austin out of the trench 20 minutes later. He was hyperventilating, his clothes covered in white clay, his hands locked completely rigid around the limestone shard, refusing to let it go until he was safely inside the back of the ambulance. The Missouri Department of Conservation conducted a full structural safety review of the ravine over the following week. When a team of specialized cave rangers descended into the undocumented entry to retrieve Austin's abandoned gear, they discovered that the vertical drainage fissure where the creature had escaped didn't lead to a dead end. The fissure connected straight to a massive subterranean network of flooded conduits that ran for miles beneath the entire Ozark River system. And when the team analyzed the limestone walls around the junction, they found thousands of the long 5-fingered claw marks carved deeply into the stone face, worn smooth by years of water flow. Something had been utilizing the dark, flooded passages of the state park to navigate beneath the feet of millions of unsuspecting tourists, campers, and boaters for generations, completely hidden from the upper world. The state authorities permanently closed the rocky ravine 3 weeks later. A heavy construction crew used industrial explosives to collapse the entrance bluff, burying the horizontal fissure under hundreds of tons of solid limestone boulders, erasing the entry from all official park directories. Austin Briggs never entered a cave again. He resigned from his wilderness guide position, sold his home in southern Missouri, and relocated to a modern high-rise apartment complex in downtown Chicago, Illinois, a place where the ground is covered in miles of solid pavement and the artificial lights of the city never turn off. He managed to rebuild a quiet indoor routine, but the psychological scars of that autumn afternoon remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to enter basements, he cannot tolerate dark rooms, and he leaves a high-powered flashlight on his nightstand 24 hours a day. Because according to Austin, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true horror lives in the realization of how fragile our safety truly is. Every time he walks across a tiled floor or hears a faint, rhythmic scratching sound from inside a wall vent, his body goes completely cold. He realizes that humanity is just living on a thin, fragile crust of reality, entirely unaware that deep within the deep dark of the world, something impossible is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the next light to go out. The appeal of extreme underground exploration is that it forces you to face a completely absolute kind of darkness. When you are hundreds of feet below the surface of the Earth, there is no ambient light from the stars, no distant rumble of traffic, and no cellular connection to the outside world. If your equipment fails, or if you lose your way, the silence that settles around you is so heavy it can drive a person completely insane. But for 28-year-old hydrogeology graduate student Owen Vance, a solo mapping expedition into an abandoned zinc mine in northern Illinois in the spring of 2016 would turn into a horrifying confrontation with something that science could not explain. He would discover that a single photograph, taken in a place where no sunlight has reached for millions of years, could capture a living nightmare. The setting for this story is the rural outskirts of Galena, Illinois. It was the 12th of May, 2016, a cold, rainy Thursday where a relentless spring downpour had turned the rolling hills into a sea of thick mud. The air outside was heavy and damp, but down inside the forgotten shafts of the Blackjack mine, the atmosphere was completely stagnant, freezing, and smelled sharply of oxidized iron, wet clay, and ancient rot. Owen was an incredibly meticulous researcher. He was working on his master's thesis, documenting the water quality in flooded, historic mine workings across the Midwest. He carried state-of-the-art gear, including a waterproof tactical backpack, a high-grade digital camera with a powerful detachable strobe flash, and a dual-battery headlamp that could throw a beam of white light for over 200 feet. Around 2:15 p.m., Owen descended the rusted iron rungs of the main air shaft, stepping off onto the floor of the mine's third level, exactly 300 feet beneath the surface. The old timber supports groaned under the immense weight of the earth above, and the only sound was the steady, rhythmic dripping of groundwater pooling in the dark, narrow tunnels. Drip, pause, drip. For nearly 3 hours, Owen walked through the desolate, stone-walled drifts, taking water samples and using a laser distance meter to map the dimensions of the passages. The blue-white beam of his headlamp cut through the heavy mist, illuminating the old rusted tracks where ore carts used to run over a century ago. At exactly 5:10 p.m., Owen reached a remote, dead-end tunnel at the very back of the third level. The passage terminated in a massive, ragged cavern where a portion of the ceiling had collapsed decades earlier, creating a steep mountain of shattered limestone boulders that blocked any further progress. Owen set his backpack down on a dry wooden crate, pulled out a fresh bottle of water, and decided to take a series of wide-angle photographs of the collapse site to include in his thesis presentation. He mounted his camera onto a lightweight tripod, adjusted the focus toward the top of the boulder pile, and connected his external strobe flash. He pressed the shutter button. The powerful strobe flash exploded with a brilliant, blinding pop of white light, completely illuminating the massive cavern, the jagged limestone blocks, and the dark, deep recesses of the ceiling with the intensity of a lightning strike. The light vanished instantly, returning the room to the narrow, steady beam of his headlamp. Owen walked over to the tripod, looking down at the small LCD preview screen on the back of his camera to review the quality of the shot. As the digital image rendered on the screen, the smile completely vanished from Owen's face. The photograph was perfectly sharp. It showed the mountain of shattered limestone and the rotten timber framing of the ceiling. But crouching right near the very top of the boulder pile, fully illuminated by the white glare of the strobe, was a shape. The anatomy was completely wrong. It was a towering, skeletal entity, its body so emaciated that its ribs and elongated spine pushed sharply against its skin like jagged ridges. The flesh was a dull, leathery, bruised gray color, completely hairless and glistened with a thick, clear fluid that looked like liquid mucus. Its double-jointed limbs were twice the length of a normal human's, its long arms ending in multi-jointed fingers with sharp black claws that were buried deep into the limestone dust. But it was the head that made the breath catch sharply in Owen's throat. The creature's neck was long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang completely upside down between its broad shoulders. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull. But where the eyes should have been, the camera flash had caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of two massive, glassy black orbs. The creature was staring straight into the camera lens, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums. Owen stood perfectly paralyzed in the dark tunnel, the small screen of his camera illuminating his face in a pale blue glow. His logical brain tried to reject it. He told himself it was a shadow, a trick of the light against the sharp angles of the broken stone. He slowly raised his head, his hand shaking violently as he directed the bright blue-white beam of his headlamp toward the top of the boulder pile. The rocks were completely empty. There was nothing but gray limestone and deep, silent shadows. Owen let out a ragged, trembling breath, trying to calm his racing pulse. He reached down to turn off his camera, intending to pack his gear and leave the mine immediately. Then, from the darkness at the top of the boulder pile, came a sound. It wasn't a rock shifting, and it wasn't the wind. It was a low, rapid, dry clicking noise, the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone, click, 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 click. And as Owen watched in absolute, unadulterated horror, the two massive, glassy black orbs materialized out of the dark, hovering just above the topmost boulder, reflecting the beam of his headlamp with a cold, predatory glare. The creature began to slide down the rock pile, its long limbs moving with a fluid, insect-like velocity, heading straight toward the floor of the tunnel. The rapid, chattering sound accelerated as the creature descended the loose rocks, its long, double-jointed limbs moving in a chaotic, spider-like scramble that sent a mini avalanche of gray limestone pebbles rattling down onto the tunnel floor. Owen completely broke. He didn't try to fold his tripod or pack his samples. He turned on his heel and sprinted down the narrow, pitch-black drift, his boots splashing violently through the cold orange mine water that pool-flooded the floor. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. The blue-white beam of his headlamp bounced wildly off the sweating rock walls and the rotten timber supports that looked ready to collapse under the pressure of the earth. The air felt incredibly thick, turning hot and suffocating, carrying that sharp, copper-like stench of stagnant river water and old rot that filled his throat with every desperate breath. Behind him, from the dark cavern, the sound changed. It wasn't just a scramble anymore. It was a heavy, wet, sliding motion, followed by the solid, rhythmic thud of four emaciated limbs striking the mine floor at an impossible speed. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was tracking the heavy vibration of his footsteps through the water, closing the distance with an insect-like velocity. Owen reached the junction of Level 3's main tracking line, his lungs burning, his chest heaving. He knew the main airshaft, his only way out, was still about 200 yards away. He looked over his left shoulder for a fraction of a second as he rounded the bend. Just 30 feet behind him, fully caught in the trailing edge of his headlamp glare, was the entity. It was crawling on all fours, its long, leathery gray torso compressed flat against the rusted ore tracks, its thin neck twisted at that horrific 90-degree angle. Its upside-down face was fixed directly on him, its unhinged jaw wide open as a clear, viscous fluid dripped from its calcified ridges into the muddy water. Owen screamed a raw sound of pure survival terror and pushed his legs to their absolute limit. He reached the base of the main airshaft, his hands slamming against the cold, rusted iron rungs of the vertical ladder that led 300 feet up to the surface. He began to climb, pulling his weight upward with a frantic, adrenaline-fueled strength. He was 10 feet up, 15 feet up, 20 feet up, his boots slipping against the wet iron bars. Below him, the clicking sound stopped. Owen stopped climbing for a split second, looking straight down into the black void of the shaft. The creature was standing at the base of the ladder, its 7-foot frame fully illuminated by the downward beam of Owen's headlamp. It didn't try to climb the rungs like a human. It slowly tilted its hairless skull back, its two massive glassy black orbs dilating as they absorbed the intense white light without a single blink. Then, with a sudden fluid grace, it leaped straight onto the vertical rock wall of the shaft, its black claws digging deep into the solid granite face as it began to scamper upward like a massive gecko, heading straight for his heels. Owen scrambled up the remaining rungs, his hands raw and bleeding from the rough iron, his mind fracturing into total madness. He could hear the creature's claws ripping through the rock just inches below his boots. Scrape, snap, scrape. As Owen reached the final 10 feet of the shaft, where the iron rungs met the concrete collar of the surface opening, his head burst through into the cold, rainy night air. The relentless spring downpour hit his face, but he didn't stop. He threw his upper body over the concrete lip, tumbling onto the thick mud of the Galena hillside. He didn't look back into the hole. He scrambled to his feet, running blindly through the torrential rain toward his utility truck, parked a quarter-mile away near the main access road. He dove into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and slammed the keys into the ignition, his body shaking so violently he could barely steer as he tore away from the abandoned mine site. The Joe Daviess County Sheriff's Department received Owen's panicked report at approximately 6:30 p.m. He was hyperventilating, his clothes covered in orange mine clay, and his hands were completely lacerated from the rusted ladder. The responding deputies, seeing the sheer state of shock on the young researcher's face, organized a tactical search team consisting of 4 armed officers and a mine safety expert to secure the location at dawn. When the team arrived at the Blackjack mine the following morning under a gray, overcast sky, the site was completely quiet. The rain had stopped, leaving the rolling hills heavy with mist. 2 deputies, armed with tactical shotguns and high-powered searchlights, descended the main air shaft to retrieve Owen's abandoned digital camera and inspect the 3rd level. When they reached the dead-end tunnel, they found Owen's lightweight tripod sitting in the mud. The aluminum legs had been completely bent and twisted into a tight metallic knot, and his waterproof backpack had been torn to shreds, its contents scattered across the floor. But what the state mining investigators discovered when they pulled the digital camera's memory card is what caused the entire site to be permanently condemned within 48 hours. The camera had captured a final automated exposure right before Owen dropped it. The image showed the vertical rock wall of the shaft looking straight down from a height of 20 feet. The gray, emaciated entity was caught perfectly by the infrared focus assist light, its long limbs splayed across the stone face, its upside-down head staring directly up into the lens. But when the image technicians magnified the dark background of the 3rd-level tunnel behind the creature, they realized they weren't looking at empty stone drifts. Slinking out from the deep, dark recesses of the old collapsed boulder pile were 4 other distinct gray silhouettes, their double-jointed limbs unfolding from the shadows, their glassy black eyes reflecting the infrared light like a cluster of predatory spiders. The mine wasn't a forgotten ruin, it was an active underground nest. The Illinois Department of Natural Resources permanently sealed the Blackjack Mine air shaft 3 weeks later. A construction crew blasted the upper concrete collar, collapsing the vertical shaft inward before pouring 50 tons of liquid industrial concrete over the opening, burying the entrance under a thick, permanent barrier. Owen Vance never finished his master's thesis, and he never entered an underground structure again. He sold his research equipment and relocated to a modern concrete slab home in the flat, arid plains of West Texas, a region with no old mines, no deep shafts, and absolutely no history. He managed to rebuild a quiet daytime routine, but the psychological scars of that rainy May afternoon remain entirely unhealed. He refuses to go near basements, he cannot tolerate dark, enclosed spaces, and he leaves a high-powered flashlight on his nightstand every single night. Because according to Owen, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down face. The true horror lives in the realization of what is sitting right beneath our feet every time he hears a faint, muffled vibration from the ground or watches a shadow shift near a vent. His body goes completely cold. He realizes that humanity is just walking on a thin, fragile crust of dirt, entirely unaware that deep within the ancient, forgotten foundations of the world, something impossible is breathing, chattering its teeth, and waiting for the next light to go out. The draw of the deep wilderness is the promise of absolute isolation. When you leave the paved highways and hike deep into the national forests of the American West, you are intentionally cutting yourself off from the safety nets of modern civilization. There are no cell towers, no emergency rooms, and no passing police cars. You are entirely dependent on your own gear, your own choices, and your own survival instincts. But for 31-year-old wilderness photographer Mason Vance, a solo backpacking trip into the high country of northern Utah in the summer of 2017 would turn into a terrifying lesson in the true meaning of isolation. He would discover that sometimes when you think you are completely alone in the middle of nowhere, you are actually sitting right on top of something else. The setting for this story is the Ashley National Forest, a massive expanse of rugged terrain defined by deep limestone canyons, high alpine meadows, and thousands of hidden sinkholes. It was the 24th of July, 2017, a day where the mountain air was incredibly crisp, smelling of dry pine needles and cold stone, but as the sun began to drop behind the peaks, a heavy, suffocating silence settled over the valleys. Mason was not a novice. He had spent his entire 20s documenting remote landscapes across North America, carrying a high-end digital camera, a satellite communication device, and a heavy-duty tactical flashlight. He was a practical, level-headed guy who looked at the natural world through a lens of science and logic. Around 5:45 p.m., Mason was exploring an unmapped plateau about 7 miles off the nearest backcountry trail when he stumbled across an unusual geological formation. In the center of a dense grove of ancient ponderosa pines, the ground simply dropped away into a massive circular limestone sinkhole. The opening was about 15 feet wide, its vertical rock walls plunging down into a pitch-black subterranean chamber. Mason felt a familiar surge of professional curiosity. He approached the edge of the pit, unbuckled his heavy camera pack, and pulled out his powerful tactical flashlight. He clicked the button, directing the blue-white beam straight down into the abyss. The light cut through the dark, illuminating a steep slope of loose gravel and boulders about 30 feet below the surface. Mason noticed that the back wall of the sinkhole didn't stop at the dirt. It opened up into a wide, horizontal cave tunnel that vanished deeper into the limestone foundations of the plateau. He decided he wanted to capture a few long exposure shots of the cave entrance before setting up his camp for the night. He secured his climbing rope to a massive pine tree, threw the line down into the pit, and slowly rappelled his body down the vertical rock wall, his heavy boots kicking up clouds of white limestone dust as he descended. When his feet hit the loose gravel floor of the sinkhole, the temperature dropped instantly, plunging from a comfortable 70 degrees on the surface to a bone-chilling 45 degrees inside the pit. The air inside the chamber was completely dead, heavy, and smelled sharply of copper, damp clay, and stagnant water. For 30 minutes, Mason sat at the base of the slope, adjusting his tripod and taking high-definition photographs of the ancient stone patterns. The only sound was the rhythmic, distant drip of groundwater striking the pebbles deep inside the horizontal tunnel. Drip. Pause. Drip. At exactly 6:32 p.m., just as the ambient sunlight at the top of the sinkhole was beginning to turn a deep, dark orange, the dripping sound stopped. Mason froze, his hand resting on his camera lens. The silence inside the cave became absolute, so heavy that he could hear the frantic rushing of the blood in his own ears. Then, from the absolute darkness of the horizontal tunnel, about 40 feet ahead of him, came a new sound. It was a slow, heavy, sliding motion against the damp clay. Slide, pause, slide, pause. It sounded exactly like someone dragging a massive sack of wet leather across the rocks. Mason immediately thought it was a mountain lion or a black bear that had used the cave as a den to escape the summer heat. He slowly reached down to his belt, grabbing his tactical flashlight, and snapped the high-powered beam straight down the center of the dark tunnel. The white light sliced through the gloom, and Mason's entire body went completely rigid. Standing right in the middle of the limestone passage, fully illuminated by the glare, was an entity. It was immeasurably tall, its emaciated torso compressed downward into a strange, spider-like posture, its ribs pushing sharply against dull, leathery gray skin that looked completely hairless and wet. Its limbs were twice the length of a normal man's, its double-jointed arms ending in long, skeletal fingers with black claws that were buried deep into the mud of the floor. But it was the face that made the breath catch sharply in Mason's throat. The creature's neck was unnaturally long, thin, and twisted at a horrific 90-degree angle, causing its hairless head to hang completely upside down between its broad shoulders. It had no visible nose or ears, just a smooth, pale skull, but where the eyes should have been, the flashlight caught the brilliant, blinding reflection of two massive, glassy black orbs. The creature was staring straight into the light, its unhinged jaw wide open, revealing a series of jagged, calcified ridges running along its gums. From deep within its throat came a low, rapid, dry clicking sound, the rhythmic chattering of bone against bone. Click, 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 click. Mason stood perfectly paralyzed, the heavy aluminum flashlight trembling so violently in his grip that the circle of white light was dancing erratically across the creature's leathery chest. His logical brain completely fractured. The creature didn't retreat from the light. It slowly shifted its weight, dragging its left limb forward with a heavy, solid impact against the limestone. Thump, step, thump, step. It was moving directly into the center of the beam, its upside-down head twitching rhythmically from side to side as the clicking sound from its throat grew louder and louder, echoing off the stone walls until the sound filled the entire subterranean chamber. Mason realized with absolute certainty that if he tried to climb that rope, the creature would reach the base of the slope before his hips even cleared the ground. With a breathless scream of pure survival panic, Mason dropped his camera equipment, turned around, and scrambled up the steep slope of loose gravel toward the vertical wall where his climbing rope was dangling. His boots slipped against the stones, his hands clawing at the dirt as he desperately tried to find leverage. Behind him, from the mouth of the dark tunnel, the rapid, four-legged scrambling started. Thump, 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 thump. The entity was ascending the slope, its long limbs propelling its emaciated body through the loose gravel with an insect-like velocity, tracking the sound of his escape. Mason grabbed the nylon climbing rope with both hands, his knuckles turning white as he hauled his lower body off the loose gravel. He climbed with a frantic, desperate energy, his boots scraping against the vertical limestone wall, sending a shower of white dust and pebbles raining down into the darkness below. Behind him, the rapid chattering sound grew deafening. The entity reached the base of the steep slope, its long, skeletal fingers tearing through the gravel as it launched its emaciated body upward. Click, 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 click. Just as Mason's hands reached the top edge of the sinkhole, where the pine needles and dirt of the forest floor met the rock, he felt a sudden, freezing draft brush against his bare ankles. He pulled his legs upward with a violent contraction of his core, and a fraction of a second later, a long gray arm shot out of the pit, its black claws snapping shut in the empty air right where his left boot had just been hanging. Mason scrambled over the edge, rolling onto his back in the dense grove of ponderosa pines. The high alpine air hit his face, but he didn't stop to draw a full breath. He scrambled to his feet, leaving his unanchored climbing rope behind, and ran blindly through the darkening woods toward the main trail 7 miles away. The forest was completely dark now, the orange twilight replaced by a pitch-black canopy that swallowed the trees. Mason didn't have his tactical flashlight. It was still sitting at the bottom of the sinkhole. He navigated by the faint silhouette of the mountain ridges against the stars, his boots crashing through the dry brush, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. Behind him, from the direction of the pine grove, came a heavy, low, crashing sound through the branches. The creature had climbed out of the pit. It was moving through the timber, its double-jointed limbs snapping pine boughs as it tracked the heavy vibration of Mason's heavy footsteps in the dirt. Mason sprinted for nearly 2 hours, his legs burning, his throat raw from the cold mountain air. He didn't look back until he burst out of the tree line onto the gravel parking area of the primary trailhead on Mirror Lake Highway. He collapsed against the side of his parked Jeep, his hands shaking so violently he could barely press the remote unlock button on his key fob. He dove into the driver's seat, locked the doors, and slammed the keys into the ignition. He didn't look at the rearview mirror. He threw the vehicle into reverse, tore out of the gravel lot, and drove straight to the Uinta Basin Ranger Station in Duchesne, Utah. The two on-duty rangers listened to Mason's report at 1:15 a.m. He was hyperventilating, his clothes covered in white limestone clay, and his fingernails were split and bleeding from clawing at the sinkhole edge. The rangers, familiar with the treacherous topography of the Ashley National Forest, but deeply unsettled by Mason's description of the entity, contacted the Uintah County Sheriff's Office to dispatch an investigative team at first light. At 6:45 a.m., a caravan consisting of 3 search and rescue trucks and 2 sheriff's deputies escorted Mason back to the plateau. Because Mason had logged his coordinates on his satellite communication device before descending, the team was able to hike directly to the dense grove of ponderosa pines. The sinkhole sat perfectly still under the morning sun, a quiet circular scar in the earth. The climbing rope was still tied to the massive pine tree, its nylon length dangling into the black void. 2 deputies, equipped with tactical gear and high-powered searchlights, lowered themselves into the pit to retrieve Mason's expensive camera equipment and inspect the cave tunnel. When their boots hit the gravel floor, the deputies shined their lights around the chamber. Mason's tripod was shattered, the aluminum legs twisted like pipe cleaners, and his digital camera body had been crushed into the mud, its glass lens pulverized into fine dust. But what the investigators discovered inside the horizontal limestone tunnel is what caused the Uintah County Sheriff to contact federal land management authorities within an hour. The horizontal cave didn't lead to a dead-end chamber. It opened up into a massive, interconnected labyrinth of subterranean passages that ran for miles beneath the entire northern Utah plateau. And when the team used a specialized high-resolution thermal imaging camera to scan the interior walls of the limestone passage, they found that the damp clay floor was completely covered in thousands of the long, 5-fingered claw prints. The tracks didn't just stay inside the cave. When the rangers analyzed the perimeter of the sinkhole on the surface, they discovered that the claw marks extended out of the pit and ran through the dense timber in perfect parallel lines, leading directly toward 3 other known sinkholes located miles away. The entity hadn't just stumbled across Mason that evening. It had been utilizing a massive underground highway system that connected the entire national forest, moving beneath the feet of thousands of unsuspecting campers, hunters, and hikers for decades, completely undetected in the deep dark. The United States Forest Service permanently closed the unmapped plateau to the public 3 weeks after the incident, citing unstable geological conditions and the risk of catastrophic cave-ins. The entrance to the sinkhole was sealed with a massive, heavy-duty steel mesh grate that was anchored directly into the limestone bedrock with industrial concrete bolts. Mason Vance never went wilderness photography again. He sold his high-end camera gear, canceled his satellite contracts, and relocated to a modern, concrete slab home in the flat suburbs of Dallas, Texas, a place with no forests, no caves, and absolutely no sinkholes. He managed to rebuild a quiet indoor routine, but the psychological scars of that July afternoon remain completely unhealed. He refuses to go near holes in the ground, he cannot tolerate dark rooms, and he uses an electronic security system that monitors the perimeter of his home 24 hours a day. Because according to Mason, the true horror of the experience isn't the memory of the chase or the creature's upside-down head. The true horror lives in the realization of what is sitting right below us. Every time he walks across a lawn or feels the floorboards flex in an old building, his body freezes. He realizes that humanity is just living on a thin, fragile crust of dirt, completely unaware that just a few feet below the surface, something is waiting in the absolute dark, chattering its teeth and listening for the sound of our footsteps.